Welcome back to Cosmic Wand. Today's story: Harry died in the final battle, betrayed by the Order, and woke as a first year with every memory intact. Before we dive in, take a second to hit subscribe and ring the bell so the next adventure always finds you. Alright, let's begin. Chapter 1. The green door. The body at Harry's feet had stopped being a man some time ago. What lay in the ash of the Great Hall was a husk with a snake's face, and the red eyes that had hunted him across 2 decades held nothing now but the gray light of a sky burned open by the night's spellfare. Harry stood over it, his wand hung at his side. The war was finished, and the silence that came after did not feel like silence so much as the world holding still to see whether the quiet would hold. It held for the length of a breath. He was aware of his own ruin in a distant, clinical way. The skin of his left hand had split along the knuckles. Blood had dried black down the inside of his sleeve. Somewhere behind his ribs, a cracked thing shifted when he moved, and the shifting was a kind of music he had grown used to. He had been the Order's instrument for so long that pain had become information and nothing more. You noted it. You decided whether it would slow the wand, then you went on. Behind him, the survivors gathered. He heard them before he turned, the scuff of boots over broken stone, the low murmur that ran through a crowd when it began to believe a thing was over. He should have turned to face them. A younger version of himself would have turned and grinned and waited to be lifted up. He had learned better. He kept his eyes on the corpse a moment longer because the corpse was the one thing in the hall that could no longer surprise him. "It's done," someone said, Kingsley's voice deep and careful, a good voice. A voice he had trusted with his life on 3 continents. "It's done," Harry agreed, and only then did he turn. They stood in a loose arc across the rubble, the last of them, the ones who had outlived the others. Their faces were lined in soot, a few wept without sound. He had buried more friends than he could hold in memory at once, and the ones in front of him were the residue of all that burying, and he loved them with the worn, functional loyalty of a man who has run out of softer feelings and keeps only the durable kind. He did not see the wands move. That was the part he would carry forward later into a place he could not yet imagine. He did not see them move. He had spent his whole life learning to see wands move, and he did not see these. "For the greater good," a voice said, not Kingsley's. An older voice, dry as turned pages, coming from a portrait propped against a fallen column where someone had set it down to rest. The painted figure inclined its silver head. Half-moon spectacles caught the gray light. "You understand, Harry, you of all people understand. A boy who carries death in his hand and the world's devotion in his name is the first chapter of a story I have read before. I am sorry. I have always been sorry." Changes nothing. The arc of figures did not lower their eyes. That was the second thing he would carry. They had decided, and they had decided together, and they looked at him while they did it because they had convinced themselves that meeting his eyes made it honest. Green light came from behind him. He had time in the way that catastrophe gives a man time to understand the geometry of it. They had put one of their own at his back while the painted thing held his attention from the front. Old craft. He had taught half of them that craft himself, in a tent in the cold, by the light of a wand he had been too tired to extinguish. The shape of the betrayal was elegant. He had time to appreciate it the way you appreciate a clean cut only after you notice you are bleeding. The curse took him between the shoulder blades. There was no pain. People expected pain, and there was none, only a great soundless subtraction, the floor going out from under the idea of standing. He saw the ash come up to meet him. He saw a pair of boots he recognized and did not let himself name the wearer, because naming would have cost him the last clear second, and he wanted the second for something better. He spent it on a face that was not there, a girl with red hair laughing in a kitchen that had burned a year ago. He spent it on her, and then the green door opened in the middle of the world, and he went through. White after that, not a place. The memory of a place scrubbed down to its bones. A long platform under a roof too high to see, and a cold light with no source, and the sense of a train that had not arrived and never would. He had been somewhere like this once. He turned slow, expecting the wreckage to follow him through, and there was nothing to follow. The platform held him alone, he thought with the flat surprise of a man reading his own obituary. So that is how it ends, not the snake, not the prophecy. The people I bled for with a portrait keeping watch. The grief, when it came, did not crash. It seeped, the way water finds the low place in a stone floor and pools there with no hurry at all. He had loved them. He had given them everything he had to give, and several things he had not known he owned, and they had counted the cost of him while he was still warm and found him too expensive to keep. The pooling spread, he let it. There was no one to perform for here, no younger soldiers to keep steady, and so for the length of that white nowhere he simply stood and let the loss run through him until it had run its course. It did not run its course. He understood eventually that it never would. He stopped waiting for it to. The platform began to come apart edge by edge, the way fog gives up a field. He did not fight it. He had nothing left to fight with, and somewhere underneath the grief sat a thought he could not yet read, a single line of cold print waiting at the bottom of a page he had not turned. The white thinned to gray, the gray thinned to black. The black had a texture close and rough, and it smelled of dust and old wood in the particular sourness of a place that does not get aired. A fist hammered on wood 8 inches from his face. Up, get up now. He came awake all at once, which was wrong, because dead men do not come awake, and the wrongness held him perfectly still while the rest of it arrived. The ceiling was a slope of unfinished board a hand's width above his nose. A cobweb hung from a nail in the corner with a single dead fly turning in it. The mattress under him was thin enough to feel the slats, a bare bulb on a frayed cord. A spider the size of a thumbnail working its way along the underside of the lowest stair, and stairs above his head, stairs he was sleeping under stairs. The cupboard. His hands came up in front of his face without his deciding it. They were a child's hands. The knuckles were smooth and unsplit. The fingers were short, the nails bitten, the skin unmarked by any of the years that had made his hands into tools. He turned them over. No scars, no callus where a wand had worn a groove. He pressed the pad of one thumb to the opposite palm and felt the give of soft, unworked flesh, and the cold print at the bottom of the page rose up at last into something he could read. He was 11. "Are you listening to me, boy?" The voice through the door was a woman's, thin and sharp and instantly, sickeningly known. "Get up and tend to the bacon, and don't you let it burn this time. Petunia, alive." Querulous and small and alive, and through the slats of the cupboard door came the ordinary morning light of Privet Drive, and from upstairs the heavy tread of a man who had died in the other life, of a heart that gave out 2 winters into the war while Harry was 3 countries away and could not have come even if he had been told. Vernon, alive. Dudley's bedsprings groaning under a weight that had not yet become a soldier's and never would now. Harry lay very still and did his sums. He had a strict policy, learned in the field, about disbelief. Disbelief was a luxury. Disbelief was a soldier standing in the open arguing with the fact of incoming fire. Whatever this was, dream or afterlife or the cruelest hex ever cast, the correct response to a thing you did not understand was to treat it as real until it proved otherwise, and to gather information at every step, so he did not pinch himself. He did not weep, though the pooling was still in him and would be for a long while. He inventoried, memory, intact. He reached for the war, and the war was there, all of it in unbearable completeness. He reached for the years before the war, and those were there too. He reached further for the things a man forgets, the dull middle of an afternoon 9 years gone, and found that those had the soft edges they were supposed to have. So, a true memory, not a planted one. The whole architecture of a life and a death sat in a skull that should not have been able to hold a tenth of it, and held it without strain. That was the first impossible thing, and he noted it and moved on. Body, a child's, 11 years old by the length of his arm and the pitch of the voice that had called him boy. He flexed his right hand and the fingers obeyed, but slowly, as though the signal had to cross a country it did not yet know the roads of. The reflexes that had kept him alive lived in a body that no longer existed. He would have to teach this one everything. He understood that in the same instant he understood how dangerous it made him, because a child with a child's hands and a veteran's mind was a thing the world had no defense prepared for, having never had cause to imagine it. Magic, he reached for that last and most carefully, because he did not know what an 11-year-old's untrained channels would do if a grown wizard's habits poured down them. He found the magic where it had always been, a banked warmth low in the chest but smaller, shallower. A well he remembered as deep, drawn down to a child's measure. He did not push on it. Pushing was how children blew the windows out of their relatives' houses, and he had a use for surprise that did not include announcing himself on the first morning. He lay in the dark of the cupboard and assembled, piece by deliberate piece, the shape of what he had been handed. A second life, run from the start, with the whole of the first one in his head. The grief had a brother then, and the brother arrived now and stood beside it without crowding it out. It was nothing so warm as the feeling that makes soldiers stand up in the open. He distrusted that as much as he distrusted disbelief. This one had no name he wanted to give it. It sat closer to the cold steadiness of a man who has lost every game he ever played and been handed the board reset, the pieces back in their ranks, and the certain knowledge of every move his opponents would make. He had watched Dumbledore play this exact board. He had watched Voldemort play it. He had been a pawn on it, pushed and sacrificed, and at last swept off, and he knew now, with a precision that no living wizard could match, where every piece would go and why. Boy, he got up. There was a discipline in answering, in being unremarkable, that he intended to wear like a cloak until he had built something underneath it. He pushed the cupboard door, and it opened the way it always had, with the little stutter where the cheap hinge caught, and the hallway of number 4 swam at him in all its appalling smallness. The carpet the color of weak tea, the framed photographs of Dudley at every age and none of Harry at any, the phone on its little table. He had stood in this hallway as a child and felt nothing but the dull ache of being unwanted. He stood in it now and felt the ground of the entire war under his feet, because this hallway was where it had all started, and he was standing in the start of it with the end in his hands. Petunia was at the stove. She did not look at him. There. And mind you don't, she stopped, because he had already crossed to the cooker and taken up the fork and begun turning the bacon with the unhurried competence of a man who had cooked over wandlight in a dozen camps, and there was something in the set of his shoulders, some economy that did not belong to the sulky child she expected. She looked at him then. He felt the look land and let it slide off. He kept his eyes on the pan. "You're quiet this morning," she said. It came out half an accusation. "Tired?" Harry said. His own voice startled him. It was high and unbroken, a child's read of a thing, and he had to spend a moment finding the bottom of it so that what came out next would not shake. "Didn't sleep." She sniffed and turned away, and the moment passed. The smallness of these people served him now as it had always cost him before. They had never once looked closely enough to see what stood in front of them. It had wounded him as a child. It was useful to him now. He would be invisible in this house for exactly as long as he needed to be, and then he would never be invisible to anyone again. He served the breakfast. He ate the heel of bread and the 2 rashers they let him have, because the body needed feeding and sentiment was no reason to starve it. He washed the pan. And the whole time, under the surface, on the ledger he kept in his head the way other men kept a notebook, he was writing. First, he was not safe. The protection of his mother's blood held this house, and the house held him, and the house was a cage Dumbledore had built and called a sanctuary. He understood the cage now from the outside. It had kept Voldemort off him as a child. It had also kept him pliable, isolated, grateful for any scrap of the wider world, so that when the scraps came they would seem like kindness, and he would follow the hand that fed them anywhere. He had followed that hand all the way to a green light in a ruined hall. He would take the protection of the blood, and he would refuse the gratitude that came bundled with it. That was the whole of his policy toward Albus Dumbledore, written on the first morning: take what protects, refuse what manipulates, and never, ever let the old man see the size of what was in his head. Second, the Horcruxes. He let the list assemble itself, and it assembled fast, because he had spent a year of the first life hunting these things in the cold with the people he loved dying around him, and that kind of knowledge does not blur. A diary in Lucius Malfoy's possession, soon to be planted on a girl he would not let it touch. A ring in a shack under the floorboards in a village called Little Hangleton, cursed badly enough to kill the cleverest wizard alive. A locket in a townhouse in London, guarded by a creature whose loyalty had been bought with cruelty and could be bought back with the truth. A cup deep in a vault under a bank run by people who did not forgive. A diadem lost in a room that became whatever a desperate person needed, on the 7th floor of a castle he would walk into in 2 months' time. A snake which would not exist as a vessel until later and could wait. And the last one, the one no one in the first life had told him about until it was time for him to die for it. His hand went up before he stopped it and pressed 2 fingers to the scar on his forehead. It was small under the soft hair. It did not hurt. It was quiet, the way a sleeping thing is quiet, and inside the quiet lay a sliver of the soul of the creature he had just watched die in a hall that had not yet been built into the future. He took the fingers away. He kept his face empty. Petunia across the kitchen would have seen a child touch his own forehead and thought nothing, and that was correct. That was exactly the amount of attention he wanted from the world. The last Horcrux was him. It had been the reason for the green light in the first life, the secret at the bottom of Dumbledore's long game, that the weapon would have to be destroyed before the war could truly end, that the child raised so carefully would have to walk into death so that the fragment in his head could be killed with him. Harry had done it once. He had walked into the forest and let it happen, and it had not even worked the way the old man planned, because the thing that protected him was older and stranger than the plan accounted for. He had survived the dying, he had won, and then they had finished the job the forest left undone, with a portrait keeping watch. Not this time. He did not yet know how he would take the fragment out of his own skull without lying down in front of a killing curse to do it. But he had been handed the one resource that made the impossible merely difficult, which was time, and the second resource that made the difficult survivable, which was the certain knowledge of his enemy's every move. He would find the method. He had years where the first time he had been given days. He dried his hands on the towel by the sink and went out into the back garden because the kitchen had begun to feel like a held breath and he wanted air. The morning was ordinary in the way only suburban mornings are, all clipped hedges and the distant grumble of a lawnmower and the smell of someone's bins gone over in the heat. He stood on the strip of concrete by the back door and turned his small face up to a sky he had last seen black and torn. He let the grief move in him one more time, deliberately, the way you press on a wound to learn its depth. The girl with the red hair was upstairs in a house in Devon she still lived in. Her brothers were alive, all of them, the twins still 2 and not yet 1. Sirius, who had been a father to him for 2 years and a memory for the rest, was sitting at this exact hour in a cell on an island in the North Sea, innocent, waiting for a rescue that in the first life had come too late to give him any years worth having. They were all alive. Every single person the war had taken from him was on this June morning breathing. He could save them, not all. He was not fool enough or young enough any more to believe in all, but more than none, many more than none. And to do it, he would have to become something the 11-year-old he was pretending to be could never become, and he would have to do it without anyone seeing the change, and he would have to carry the weight of every death he already remembered while he worked to prevent it, knowing the whole time that the future he was unmaking had contained, somewhere in its wreckage, the only version of these people he had actually known. The girl he had loved had been shaped by a war he was about to erase. Save her, and he saved a stranger who happened to share her face. He understood that. He accepted it. He had made harder trades than this one and would again. A noise at the side gate brought him back. The Dursleys' next-door neighbor, Mrs. Number 5, peering over the fence with the frank nosiness of the permanently bored. He gave her the blank, slightly cowed look that the child of this house was supposed to give, and she lost interest and withdrew, and he marked the smallness of the performance and how easily the old reflex still fit. Good, he could be the child they expected for as long as the part required. He went back inside before he was missed. He did not have long, he reminded himself. The letters were coming. They came that afternoon. The first one dropped through the slot with the gas bill and the catalog, and Harry, who had positioned himself in the front room with a dust rag he was not using, watched Vernon's thick hand sort the post and stop. He knew the envelope, heavy yellowish parchment, emerald ink, no stamp, Mr. H. Potter, the cupboard under the stairs, 4 Privet Drive. He knew the address because Dumbledore had ordered it written so, with that precise cruelty the old man dressed as whimsy. A letter that told a neglected child the wizarding world saw exactly where he slept and had chosen to leave him there for 10 years anyway, and would now arrive like a rescue. The address was a hook. The whole of his early life had been hooks, and he had bitten every one. Vernon's face went the dull plummet went before it went purple. "Pet," he said, "Pet, come here." Harry kept dusting the same square inch of mantle. In the first life he had snatched for the letter and been beaten back, and the wanting had been real and had made the eventual escape feel like deliverance. None of that moved in him now. He knew what the letter said. He had no need to read it. What he needed was to be in the room, watching, learning the timing of events he intended to ride rather than be carried by. The Dursleys did what the Dursleys had done. The shouting, the burning, the nailing shut of the letterbox. The letters came faster, 2 then 4 then a dozen, then the famous Sunday when they came down the chimney in a white blizzard and Vernon's nerve broke and he piled the family into the car and drove them in the end to a rock in the sea. Harry let himself be driven. He could have stopped it a dozen ways. He could have spoken to Petunia of her sister in words that would have unstrung the woman where she stood. He could have let a flicker of real magic loose and watched Vernon fold. He did none of it, and the not doing was its own discipline. He needed Hagrid to come, not because he needed rescuing, but because the half-giant was the one person in the early game whose kindness had never once been counterfeit, and Harry intended to know, this time, exactly which of the hands reaching for him were real. Hagrid's was real. He would let Hagrid find him on the rock the way it had happened before, and he would let the warmth of it land, because a man who refuses all warmth on principle becomes, in the end, the thing the portrait had feared, and Harry had decided in the white nowhere that he would die a second time before he became that. The hut on the rock was as cold and rotten as he remembered. Vernon had a rifle, which read to Harry's grown understanding as the act of a cornered animal rather than the buffoonery a child had seen. Dudley snored on the sagging couch. Petunia and Vernon had taken the lumpy bed, and Harry lay on the floor by the dead grate with a blanket that smelled of mildew, and he watched the second hand of Dudley's wristwatch crawl toward midnight. He had turned 11 in this body. At some point he could not pin down, having never been sure of his own birthday as a child because no one had ever marked it. But midnight on the 31st of July was a different threshold, and he found he wanted to be awake for it, not for the cake Hagrid would bring, but because it was the hinge of the whole machine, the moment the wizarding world's hand closed on him, and the long manipulation began. He wanted to meet it with his eyes open. He had met it asleep the first time, an ordinary unloved child, and woken into a story written for him by other people. This time he would be awake when the door came down. He had 2 tests to run before the door came down, and the dark was the only privacy this life had so far offered him. The first was the magic. He lay still and reached down into the banked warmth in his chest, and he did it the way a man checks a frayed rope before he trusts his weight to it, an inch at a time, ready to let go. He wanted the smallest thing the channels would give, not a spell. A spell would draw on more than a child's body could spare, and it would also draw the attention of the trace which sat on him already, a thin cold thread anchored somewhere in a ministry record room. He reached instead for warmth alone, the kind that has no shape and casts no light, and he asked the air above his open palm to grow a few degrees less cold. For a moment nothing. Then the skin of his hand prickled, and the dark over his palm went soft and close, and he held it there at the edge of his control and let it go again before it could become anything the trace would name. The well was shallow. The well would deepen with use, the way it had the first time, only this time he knew the exercises that deepened it fastest and the ones that wasted years. He closed his hand. That was enough. He had proven the engine turned over. The rest was throttle and road. The second test was harder because it could not be done with a hand. He built the walls. A clumency had taken him years to learn the first time badly under a teacher who hated him and a headmaster who wanted the lessons to fail, and he had carried the finished discipline back into this skull intact, which was a mercy he did not examine too closely. He laid the foundations now in the dark. He took the war and folded it small. He took the green light and the boots and the portrait and the white nowhere, and he set them behind a door at the back of a house he built room by room in the space behind his eyes. and across the front of the house he hung the furniture an ordinary unloved orphan would carry. The cupboard, the cooking, the cousin's fists, the long gray one of a childhood no one had wanted to share. A man who looked into him would find that house first. He would find a sad, sharp, lonely child, and he would find it convincing because every brick of it was true. The truth was the best lie there was. Harry had learned that from the very wizard who would soon try to read him, and he intended to use the lesson on its teacher. When the house was built, he did the thing he had promised himself he would do once and not again. He opened the door at the back and he looked at the boots. He had refused to name the wearer in the dying second, because the second had been worth more spent on the girl with the red hair. He named the wearer now. He turned the memory over in the dark and made himself see the cut of the cloak above the boots, the hand, the wand, the face that had not had the decency to look away. He knew that face. He had trusted it across 100 miles of bad country. It had carried him once 3 days through a forest with a curse eating his leg, and it had killed him in a hall on the orders of a portrait, and both of those were true at the same time, and a younger man would have broken himself trying to make them one thing. Harry did neither. He looked until the looking stopped costing him anything new, which took a long time, and the rain ran down the inside of the window the whole while. Then he closed the door on the boots in the face, and he sealed the house, and he let the wearer go back to being, for now, a stranger who had not yet done anything. In this life, the wearer was a grown wizard going about a grown wizard's business, guilty of nothing, owed nothing, watched. That was all. That was enough. He would decide later, with a colder head than the dark allowed, what was to be done about a man who had not yet betrayed him and now never would, because Harry would see to it that the hall where it happened was never built. The wind off the sea worked at the hut. Rain ran in threads down the inside of the window. He thought in the dark about the order of operations. Diagon Alley first, and Gringotts, and the goblins who would matter later more than they could imagine now. The wand, which he would have to receive as though it surprised him. Ron Weasley, red hair and a smudge on his nose, whom he had loved like a brother and watched bleed out on a hillside in the 3rd year of the war, and who was tonight asleep in a crooked house in Devon with no idea that any of it was coming. He would find Ron early. He would find the clever, lonely girl on the train who had died saving a town that never thanked her. He would find Neville Longbottom, round-faced and flinching at his own shadow, who had grown in the end into the bravest person Harry ever knew, and who in the first life had been left to find that courage alone and far too late. He would gather them early. He would tell them nothing they could not bear and everything they needed, and he would not let the old men of either side use them as kindling. He did not let himself plan past the gathering. Plans that reached too far became wishes, and wishes got soldiers killed. He held the next 3 moves and no more, the way you hold a railing on a dark stair. Boom, the whole hut shook, dust sifted from the rafters. The watch on Dudley's wrist read midnight, and outside beyond the streaming window something very large and very patient had decided to come in. Boom, the door shuddered on its hinges. Vernon was up, the rifle shaking in his hands, bellowing threats at the dark. Petunia clutched a poker. Dudley had fallen off the couch and lay among the blankets with his small eyes huge. And Harry, on the floor by the cold grate, sat up slowly and pushed his glasses up his nose and looked at the door with the calm of a man watching a tide he had timed to the minute, and waited for the green door of his second life to open the rest of the way. The 3rd blow took the door off its hinges and laid it flat, and a shape filled the gap where it had been. Broad as a barn, dripping seawater, wild black hair and beard hiding everything but 2 glittering beetle eyes. "Sorry Abu that," Hagrid said, and stepped over the fallen door and stooped to lift it and fit it neatly back into the frame, and it held. "Couldn't make myself heard." He turned and his eyes found Harry where he sat, and the whole vast face changed, opened, the beetle eyes going bright and wet. "And here's Harry," he said in a voice gone thick. "Last time I saw you, you was only a baby. You look a lot like your dad, but ye have got your mum's eyes." Harry got to his feet. The body did it clumsily, 11 years of bone moving the way 11-year-old bone moved, and he let it be clumsy because the part required it. He looked up a long way up into the face of the first person in 2 lifetimes to look at him and want nothing from him but the fact of his being alive. "Hello, Hagrid," he said. It was the right thing and the wrong thing. Hagrid blinked because he had not given his name, and his brow creased. Harry watched it come and made the correction without a hitch, lifting one hand to the side of his own head in the universal gesture of a child who has heard a story. "I'm Mum and Dad's friend. Aunt Petunia talks, sometimes." A lie smooth as glass, delivered with a child's shy half-glance at the woman by the bed, who was in fact at that moment looking at the half-giant with the white face of someone seeing the past walk through her door. The crease cleared from Hagrid's eyes, and a glare took its place, aimed over Harry's head at Petunia. "Talks, does she?" he rumbled. "We'll see what she's been talking." And he reached inside his enormous coat, and the next several minutes belonged to the part Harry had decided to let play out. The squashed birthday cake in its box, the fire roaring up green in a grate that had been dead a moment before, the sausages, the letter at last pressed into Harry's hands with Hagrid watching to see him read it. Harry read it. He let his eyes move down the parchment he could have recited backward. He let his face do something quiet and uncertain, because a child reading that he was a wizard ought to look uncertain, and the version of himself that the world needed to see was a child. Underneath the performance the ledger went on writing, Hagrid, ally total, never to be spent carelessly. The stone, in transit even now, vault 713, soon to be carried to a corridor on the third floor where, in the first life, 3 half-grown children had stumbled into Voldemort's first attempt to claw his way back into a body. Quirrell, already hollowed out, already carrying his master under that ridiculous turban, already in Diagon Alley waiting in the dark of the leaky cauldron for the famous orphan to walk in so the wraith on the back of his skull could get its first long look at the child it had failed to kill. "Ye'll be wantin' your things," Hagrid was saying. "We'll go tomorrow, London, get you sorted." His face fell. "If ye want ter, that is, I mean, ye do want ter done, yeah." Across the hut Vernon found his voice and used it badly, as he always had, blustering about not paying for some crackpot school to teach him magic tricks. Hagrid turned on him slowly, and Harry watched and did not intervene, because there were moments a man was owed, and Hagrid had been owed this one for 10 years. The umbrella came up. The words about Dumbledore came out, the great booming loyalty of them, and Harry kept his face down so the thing that crossed it would not be seen. There it was, the name. Spoken by the one honest mouth in the early game, wrapped in a devotion so complete that Hagrid would have walked into fire on the strength of it, had walked into worse, would again. The half-giant loved the old man without reservation, and the devotion was good, and the devotion was the leash, and the leash was the whole problem in a single syllable. You could not warn Hagrid. You could not so much as breathe a doubt about Dumbledore in front of him without the doubt going straight up the line to the half-moon spectacles by morning. Harry understood this with the worn patience of someone who had learned it the slow way. Hagrid was a wall he loved and could not see past, and on the far side of the wall the old man waited already even now, to begin reading the famous orphan like a book he had written himself. Let him read, Harry thought. Let him read every page I show him, and not one I don't. Yeah, he said aloud, and made himself smile up at Hagrid, and the smile cost him because it was real. Dragged up out of the wreckage of a friendship he remembered ending in a graveyard full of the people they had both failed to save. Yeah, I want to, Hagrid beamed. Outside, the storm had begun to slacken, the wind dropping from a howl to a long, exhausted sigh, and through the window the first gray suggestion of dawn lay along the line where the sea met the sky. Dudley snored. Vernon had subsided into a chair, defeated, clutching the rifle he had not dared to fire. Petunia sat very still on the edge of the bed with her arms wrapped around herself and her eyes on Harry, and there was in her face, for the length of a heartbeat, something he had never seen there as a child and only recognized now, with 2 lifetimes behind his eyes. Not affection. Petunia would never manage anything so warm. The look of someone who had seen what the world he was about to enter could do, who had lost a sister to it, who had taken in the leavings of that loss and resented the leavings precisely for how much they recalled what she had lost. He looked back at her, and for once he did not flinch, and whatever she saw in the eyes of the small, calm child across the hut made her look away first. He lay down again by the cold grate, while Hagrid settled his bulk against the wall and began almost at once to snore like a slow avalanche. Harry did not sleep. He watched the gray light strengthen at the window and ran the next 3 moves and no more, and somewhere out past the dark sea, in a cottage and a cell and a crooked house and a castle, every piece of the board he had lost once stood waiting in its rank for a game he intended, this time, to win. Grief stayed where it was, low in him, pooled in the stone. He did not expect it to leave. He had stopped in the white nowhere, expecting it to leave. He had decided instead to carry it the way you carry a stone you have agreed to set down only at the end of a very long road, and the road began here on the floor of a freezing hut. On the first morning of the rest of a life he had been given back by a door he never saw open and a death he had not been allowed to keep. Dawn came up over the water. Hagrid snored, and Harry Potter, 11 years old, watched the light and began. Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. Reading the board, Dawn found the sea flat and gray and the storm spent, and Hagrid rowed them back to the mainland in a little boat that rode lower in the water than any boat had a right to, tapping it once with his pink umbrella so that it cut the swell on its own while he sat back and watched the horizon. Harry sat in the bow with Hedwig's empty future on his arm, not yet bought, and looked at the receding rock and thought about how small the world's hinges were. A hut, a boat, a half-giant with a broken wand stub hidden in an umbrella. The whole machine of the war turned on moments like this, and he was inside one of them, awake, where the first time he had been a child being carried along. "You can't tell anyone aboo the umbrella," Hagrid said, suddenly anxious. "Strictly speakin', I'm not supposed ter do magic. Expelled, see, long story." "I won't tell," Harry said, and meant it, because the secret was real and the trust behind it was real, and a man kept the few real things carefully. Hagrid relaxed, and the boat ran on, and the gulls wheeled over them in the brightening air, and Harry let himself, for the length of the crossing, simply be carried by someone who wished him well. He would not get to do that often. He took it where it came. They caught a train from a little station, Hagrid filling 2 seats and knitting what might have been a canary-yellow tent, and the green country slid past the window all morning until it gave way to the brick and grime of London. Harry watched it come and ran his lists, and by the time they came up out of the underground into a city that smelled of rain on hot pavement, the day's order of operations sat clean in his head. Hagrid steered him through the crowds with one enormous hand hovering at his shoulder, never quite touching, the way a person herds something he is afraid of breaking. Muggles parted around them without knowing why. Harry kept pace and kept quiet and let his eyes do the work. He had walked this street as a child and seen only the size and shine of it. He walked it now and saw the angles, the exits, the sightlines, the gap between 2 buildings where a wizard could step sideways out of the world. The Leaky Cauldron sat in that gap, a grubby little pub the eyes of passing Londoners slid off without catching. Hagrid ducked under the lintel. Harry followed, and the warm beer-soaked dark closed over him, and the talk inside stopped the way talk stops when a draft blows a door open. "Bless my soul," whispered the toothless old barman, and the word went around the room before Hagrid had finished ordering. "Potter, Harry Potter." They came at him then, a tide of them, hands out, eyes wet, voices climbing over each other. A man pumped his hand and could not let go. A pale woman in a hairnet came back to shake it 3 separate times. He gave them what they needed, which was the sight of him, small and bespectacled and alive, the proof that the thing they had survived had truly ended. He had learned in the first life to begrudge this. He did not begrudge it now. They had been frightened for a long time, and he had been the proof they could finally stop, and there was no profit in grudging frightened people the comfort of it. He kept the house behind his eyes shut the whole while. Somewhere in this room was the one person he had come early to find. He let his gaze travel the crowd at the pace a dazzled child's would, and it snagged exactly where he had known it would, on a young man in a purple turban hanging back by the cold hearth, pale, twitching. A smell off him that Harry's grown nose caught under the beer and the pipe smoke, a thin reek of garlic laid over something colder and older that the garlic was meant to hide. "P.P. Potter," Quirrell stammered, coming forward with his hand trembling. "See, can't tell you how pleased I am to meet you." "Professor Quirrell," Hagrid said, beaming. "Harry, Professor Quirrell will be one o' your teachers, Defense Against the Dark Arts." Harry took the offered hand. It was cold and damp, and it flinched in his grip, and the scar on his forehead, which had lain quiet since he woke too, a thin needle of heat sliding in behind his eye. He let it come. He had learned long ago to read pain as a message rather than a wound, and the message was clear enough. The thing on the back of the skull, behind the turban under the garlic, had turned its attention on him and did not yet know what it was looking at. Harry held the house shut and let him look. Let it see a child who flinched at the cold hand and dropped his eyes. That was the page he turned face up. Behind it the rest of the house stood dark and locked. "And nervous, are you?" Quirrell said, and something moved at the back of his eyes that was not Quirrell. "Wise, dark days, P. Potter, dark days." "Yes, sir," Harry said in the reed of a child's voice, and took his hand back, and the needle in his scar cooled as the attention slid off him, satisfied. He had what he needed from the exchange, which was confirmation. The Wraith was here, on schedule, riding its host toward a corridor on the 3rd floor and a mirror that showed a man his heart. Harry knew where it was going. He knew when. The whole of the year's first move had just shaken his cold, wet hand and stammered at him and gone away with no idea it had been measured. Hagrid drew him out through the back of the pub into a tiny walled courtyard where the dustbin stood, and tapped the bricks in their pattern, and the wall folded itself open onto a cobbled street that twisted away under crooked roofs toward a snowy marble building at its far end. "Diagon Alley," Hagrid said, with the satisfaction of a person unveiling something he loved. Harry looked down the length of it. Cauldrons stacked outside an apothecary, owls in a shaded window. A broomstick with a knot of children pressed to the glass before it. He had loved this street once with the whole undefended heart of a boy who had just learned the world was bigger and stranger than he had been allowed to believe. The street had not changed. He had. He looked at the marble building at the end and thought about what lay in its vaults and under its floors and what he would need from the people who ran it and the order in which he would have to ask. "Gringotts first," he said. "I'll need money before anything else." Hagrid blinked at the briskness, then grinned and clapped him very gently on the shoulder, which still rocked him on his feet. "Ye, I've got a head on ye, like your mum. Come on then." The bank rose white and crooked above them, its bronze doors flanked by goblins in scarlet and gold. Over the silver inner doors ran the old verse about thieves and what the vaults did to them, and Harry let his mouth move along with the words like a child sounding them out, and underneath he was thinking about a vault very deep down with a golden cup in it, and the precise nature of the protections the warning only gestured at. He would need a goblin for that in the end, not yet. But the relationship started today, and relationships with goblins, he had learned at great cost, were built on a currency that was not gold. The goblin at the high counter took Harry's key from Hagrid and turned it in his long fingers and looked at it, then looked down over the counter at Harry, and Harry looked back up at him, and did the thing a dazzled child would never have thought to do. He inclined his head, not a bow. A nod the kind one gives an equal whose ground one is standing on, the kind that says, "I know whose house this is." The goblin's eyes sharpened. "Vault 687, he said, and to the side, Griffook. And as a second goblin came forward to lead them, the first held Harry's gaze a beat longer than he needed to, and Harry let him and said nothing, because there was nothing yet to say and everything to establish, and the first thing to establish with a goblin was that you saw him. The cart ride down was a long shrieking plunge through the dark, past underground lakes and stalactites teethed with frost, and Hagrid went green and clutched the side, and Harry rode it steady, because a person who is apparated under fire is not troubled by a mine-cart on rails. They fell deeper than the cart had ever taken him as a child, or so it felt, the air going colder and older the further down they went, and somewhere below them, he knew deeper still, lay the high-security vaults where the oldest families kept the things they did not trust to daylight. One of those held the cup. He marked the depth of the descent and the time it took and the way the goblin worked the brake, and added it all to the part of the ledger that would matter in the spring. Griffook worked the lock of Vault 687, and the door breathed out its cold mineral air, and inside, in the lamplight, sat the mounded gold his parents had left him. Hagrid had told him once that there was a small fortune here. There was more than that. There was leverage, and leverage was the only kind of money that interested him now. He filled the pouch Hagrid gave him unhurried, and then, while the half-giant was still recovering his stomach by the cart, Harry crouched by the nearest heap and spoke to Griffook in a voice pitched too low for a half-giant's ears. "If a wizard wanted to know whether a thing he owned carried a curse," Harry said, "or a dark thing bound inside it, would your people be the ones to ask?" Griffook's head came around slow. The lamplight caught the points of his teeth. "Curse-breaking is the bank's trade," he said. "For those who can pay it and who understand that the bank's discretion is not free." "I understand discretion isn't free," Harry said. "I understand it's the most expensive thing you sell. I may have need of it, not today. I wanted to know the door was there before I came knocking on it." For a long moment the goblin studied him, this small bespectacled human child crouched in the gold speaking the grammar of obligation and price, and whatever he concluded he kept behind his teeth. "The door is there," he said at last. "Knock and bring something worth our while." And that was all, and it was enough, and Harry stood and brushed the cold dust of his own fortune off his knees and let Hagrid help him back into the cart as though the exchange had never happened. They stopped at one more vault on the way up, deeper even than his own, a vault with no keyhole that Griffook opened by drawing one long finger down its seam. Hagrid heaved himself out and ducked inside and came back with a grubby package wrapped in brown paper, which he buried in the depths of his coat with the air of a man carrying something he had been told not to drop and not to discuss. "Best not to mention that," Hagrid said. "Hogwarts business, very secret." "All right," Harry said, and looked at the brown paper, and saw through it to a stone the color of dried blood that could turn metal to gold and water into the elixir of unending life, and that a wraith in a purple turban wanted badly enough to drink a unicorn dry in the dark of a forest. Vault 713, emptied today by the one person Voldemort's servant could not get past. Carried up to a castle and hidden behind a sequence of obstacles built by teachers, the last of them a mirror, and behind the mirror a trap that, the first time, 3 children had nearly died springing. He let the brown paper vanish into Hagrid's coat. He knew where the stone was going. He had the whole back half of the first act in his head, and he meant to rewrite its ending so that no child had to bleed for it. Out in the daylight again, Harry blinked in the brightness and let Hagrid recover with a restorative something from a flask, and then they set about the list. Madame Malkin's was full of the smell of new wool and the snip of enchanted scissors. Harry was stood on a stool beside another child being fitted, a pale pointed boy with white blonde hair combed flat, and he knew the face as he knew all the faces now, with 2 lifetimes of weather on it. Draco Malfoy at 11 was a small recital of his father's opinions, and Harry had hated him once with the uncomplicated heat of a schoolboy, and had watched him, much later, lower his wand on a tower rather than commit a murder, and had dragged him out of a fire that meant to eat him, and had stood across a courtroom from him at the very end and watched a pale, frightened man fail to lift his eyes. All of that lived behind the child on the next stool, and none of it was written yet. "Warts too," Draco drawled in the bored voice he had been taught. "My father's buying my books next door, then I'm going to drag my mother to look at racing brooms. I don't see why first years can't have their own. I think I'll bully father into getting me one." The first time Harry had bristled at this, and had taken the bait when Draco started in on the wrong sort of family, and had walked out of the shop having made an enemy without meaning to and learned nothing useful. He did not bristle now. An enemy made at 11 over a racing broom was a waste of an enemy. He looked at the pale child reciting his father's lines and saw a thing that could be turned in time with patience and the right pressure at the right seam, and he had no use for him yet, but he had no use for hating him either. "Brooms are good," Harry said mildly. "I haven't flown, which is the best one." It threw Draco off his script. He had a needle laid out for the famous Potter, and the famous Potter had stepped around it and asked him a question he liked the answer to. and for a moment he was only a child who wanted to talk about brooms, and he did at length, and Harry listened, and asked one or two more questions and learned, among other things, that Lucius Malfoy was indeed next door at this hour with money in his pocket and a son to indulge. When Madame Malkin pronounced Harry done, he stepped off the stool and said, "See you at school, then," in a friendly enough way, and left a faintly puzzled Draco behind him, having spent nothing and bought himself, for the price of 3 minutes of patience, the open door of a boy who had expected scorn and met courtesy instead. Doors like that cost nothing to leave open. He had learned to leave a great many of them open and walk through only the ones that mattered later. He found Lucius Malfoy at Flourish and Blots. He had not gone looking exactly. The bookshop was on the list, and Hagrid had wandered off toward a snarling volume on the care of dragons, and Harry was gathering the set text when he saw, down a long aisle of leather and gilt, a tall, pale man with a silver-headed cane and hair to his shoulders, turning the pages of a slim black book with the bored distaste of a man pricing something he intends to be rid of. Harry knew the book. He had stabbed it through the heart with a basilisk fang, in another life, in a wet chamber under the school, after it had nearly killed a girl by writing itself into her one entry at a time. The diary. Tom Riddle's diary, with a sliver of soul folded inside it, and Lucius Malfoy holding it in 2 fingers and thinking, no doubt, about a ministry he wanted weakened, and a Weasley girl he had never met, and a way to do harm at a distance with deniability draped over it. Harry took a book down from a shelf and pretended to read it, and over its top he watched the diary go back into the inner pocket of an immaculate robe. Not today, then. The diary would sit in that pocket through the autumn and the winter and into the next summer, when Lucius would slip it among a Weasley girl's second-hand school books in this very shop, in a scuffle he would provoke for the cover of it. Harry had a year to decide how to take it out of that pocket before it ever reached her. He had ideas already, none of them clean, all of them better than letting a child spend a year being hollowed out by a dead man's diary while the grown wizards who could have stopped it looked the other way. Lucius Malfoy paid for his son's books and swept out without a glance at the small bespectacled child by the shelf, which suited the child by the shelf perfectly. Harry watched him go, and added a line to the ledger, and went to find Hagrid before he could buy the dragon book. He did the rest of the shopping with the brisk efficiency of a man working a list he had memorized, and he added to it as he went, in ways a child would not have known how to. At the apothecary he bought the standard ingredients and also, quietly, the makings of a draught that sharpened focus and another that beat back exhaustion, because the body he now wore would need both if he meant to push it as he intended. At Flourish and Blots, while Hagrid was still distracted, he had drifted into the deeper aisles and come away with a primer on occlumency he did not need but would be expected to own honestly if anyone ever asked how a first year knew the discipline, a heavy text on defensive enchantment, a treatise on the theory of curse breaking, and a slim, costly volume on the history and detection of dark artifacts that the clerk sold him with a raised eyebrow and no questions. He paid in gold and let Hagrid believe he had bought only the school books. The trunk he chose with care, plain to the eye, but the shopkeeper who sold it could be persuaded, for a few extra galleons, to fit a second compartment beneath the first with a lock of its own, and Harry had use for a place that locked. Into it, in time, would go the books no first year should own, and the drafts, and a good deal else besides. At Aelip's Owl Emporium he stopped and stood in the doorway in the cool hooting dark, and did not move for a moment longer than he had meant to. She was on the second perch from the door, a snowy owl with eyes the color of a winter sun, turning her head to fix him with a look of frank appraisal. He had buried her himself in the first life in a hole he dug with his bare hands beside a windswept road, wrapped in his own jacket, the first death of that last year and the one that had told him before any of the human deaths exactly how the year was going to go. She had died flying to him. She had always been flying to him. And here she was on a perch in a shop, alive, irritable, regarding him as though deciding whether he would do. The grief came up through him quietly, and he let it, because no one was watching who mattered, and because she deserved to be mourned by someone who knew what she would one day become. Then he set it down and crossed the shop and held up his arm, and she stepped onto it like a creature keeping an appointment. Her, he told the shopkeeper, and his voice held, which it had not been entirely certain to do. Hagrid, when he came in and saw the owl, lit up like a man who had been searching for the perfect gift and found it already chosen. "Tell ye what, Harry, I'll get her for ye, birthday present." And Harry let him, because Hagrid's giving was one of the few clean things left in the world, and a person did not refuse a clean thing without good reason, and he carried the owl out into the alley on his arm and did not say her name aloud, not yet, because the name belonged to a future he was unmaking, and he wanted this time to give it to her freshly when they were alone. That left the wand. Ollivander's was narrow and dim and smelled of dust and kept secrets, thousands of slim boxes stacked to a ceiling lost in shadow, and the old man came out from among them on feet that made no sound, his pale wide eyes finding Harry across the gloom and fixing there. "I wondered when I would be seeing you, Mr. Potter," almost a whisper. It seems only yesterday your mother and father were in here buying their first wands." He went through the ritual, the measuring tape that moved on its own, the murmured remembrances of wands sold long ago and the deeds done with them. Harry stood still and let it happen and watched the old man with the wariness one brings to a clever animal, because Garrick Ollivander missed very little and forgot nothing, and there were things in the house behind Harry's eyes that he of all people might catch the edge of, since his whole life had been spent reading the fit between a wand and the hand that reached for it. The first wand did nothing, the second cracked a vase, the third Ollivander snatched back before Harry had fully closed his fingers. The pile of tried-and rejected boxes grew, and the old man grew happier with each failure, muttering that here was a tricky customer, that he did so relish a tricky customer. Harry knew which wand it would be. He could have walked to the shelf and found the box himself. He let the old man hunt, because letting people show you what they already mean to show you is the cheapest courtesy there is, and when Ollivander finally drew out a particular box, dusted it, and lifted the wand from its bed of tissue, Harry felt the warmth in his chest lean toward it before his fingers had so much as closed. Holly and phoenix feather, 11 inches supple. He took it and the warmth rushed up his arm and out through the wood, and a fan of red and gold sparks fell from the tip like the last of a fire dying, and the old man cried out softly and clapped his hands. "Oh, bravo, yes indeed, very good, how curious, how very curious." Harry kept his face on the page he wanted seen, round-eyed and open-mouthed, a child holding magic in his hand for the first time, and waited, because he knew what was coming and wanted to hear how it landed this time. "It is curious," Ollivander murmured, leaning close, "that you should be destined for this wand when its brother gave you that scar." He touched the air near Harry's forehead. 13.5 inches, you, a powerful wand, very powerful and in the wrong hands. I sold it, and its core came from the very same phoenix that gave the feather in yours. Curious indeed how these things happen. The wand chooses the wizard, Mr. Potter. We must expect great things from you. He who must not be named did great things. Terrible, yes, but great. The first time Harry had felt a chill at this and not understood it. He understood it now to the bone. The two wands were brothers, and brothers could not properly fight each other, and that single fact had saved his life once in a graveyard and would shape every confrontation he chose to engineer from here forward. He let the chill move across his child's face because it was natural and concealed nothing of value. What he did not let show was the arithmetic running beneath it, the long cold sum of a man who has just confirmed that the weapon in his hand and the weapon in his enemies are built to refuse each other, and who is already turning the fact over, looking for the edge buried in it. "Thank you," Harry said, and paid his 7 galleons, and let Ollivander wrap the wand, and met the pale, searching eyes one last time without giving him anything to find. The old man held the look a moment, the way the goblin at the counter had, with the dim awareness of a craftsman that something in the grain did not run as he had expected, and then it passed, and Harry stepped out into the alley with a wand he had carried into 2 lifetimes of fire. The light was going gold over the rooftops by the time they were finished. Hagrid bought him a hamburger from a stall, and they sat on the steps of a shuttered shop front while Harry ate, the owl drowsing on his new trunk, and Hagrid talked about Hogwarts and the houses and Quidditch and the giant squid in the lake, and Harry listened with half his attention and gave the other half to the ledger. The first act of the year sat clear in front of him. The stone was in Hagrid's coat, bound for the 3rd floor. Quirrell and his passenger were bound there too, by slow degrees across the autumn term. He had the whole map. He had the wand, the gold, the books, the trunk that locked, the owl, a goblin who knew his face and a door that existed, a list of people to find on a scarlet train, and a list of things to destroy in the dark. And at the end of that list, the hardest piece on the board, the fragment of soul behind his own scar, which would have to wait until he had worked out how to take it out without dying to do it. "Ye have gone quiet again," Hagrid said. "Just thinking," Harry said, "about school, about what I want to do there." Hagrid chuckled, a low, warm rumble. "Ye'll have a grand time, make friends, learn your spells, don't go looking for trouble, mind." Harry looked down the darkening alley toward the place where the wall would fold open and let him back out into the ordinary world for one more month of pretending. Trouble was not a thing he meant to go looking for. He knew exactly where it lived and when it would stir and what it would try first. He meant to be standing there waiting for it with the lights on. "I won't go looking," Harry said, which was true, and Hagrid took it the way it was meant and missed the thing underneath it, which was that a man who knows precisely where the trouble is has no need to look. He spent the last month at Privet Drive the way a soldier spends the lull before a campaign, in preparation that looked from the outside like nothing at all. The Dursleys gave him Dudley's 2nd bedroom rather than keep a wand-carrying wizard under the stairs, and Harry took the room and the privacy that came with it and put both to use. He could not cast. The tray sat on him still, and underage magic would bring the owls and questions he had no answers ready for. But there was a great deal a man could do without a wand, and he did it. He drilled a clumency until the house behind his eyes stood without effort, until he could hold a flat, dull breakfast-table conversation with the war locked silent at his back and not a flicker of it reaching his face. He drew the well of his magic up by inches with the breathing exercises that fed it, the ones he had wasted 3 years not knowing the first time, until the warmth in his chest ran a little deeper each week. He read the books from the locked compartment by torchlight under the blanket, not because he needed the spells, but because he needed his child's hands to relearn the shapes his grown hands had known, the small, precise movements, so that when at last he cast, the fluency would not betray how little a first year had any business being able to do. The household had changed around him, though no one in it could have said how. Dudley, who had spent 10 years using Harry as something to chase, took one look at the cool, unbothered cousin who now met his eyes across the landing and lost his appetite for the sport. There was nothing to chase. The thing that had made the chasing worth the effort, the flinch, the running, the satisfying give of a smaller creature giving way, had simply gone out of Harry, and Dudley, who was not clever but was an animal of fine instincts, stopped coming near him and could not have told you why. Vernon blustered at dinner about freakishness and ingratitude, and Harry ate his food and agreed with him pleasantly wherever agreement cost nothing, and the bluster, finding no purchase, thinned week by week into a wary muttering. A man can only shout so long at someone who declines to be afraid. Petunia was harder and more interesting. She watched him now the way a person watches whether coming in over a field, and once, near the middle of August, she set a plate in front of him and did not at once take her hand from the rim. "You go quiet like she did," she said to the window, not to him. Before, she used to go quiet exactly like that. She had never in his life offered a word about his mother. He understood the shape of it, the way old grief turns sideways in people who have refused it for decades and comes out wearing the face of spite. He could have used the opening. He could have unstitched her in 3 sentences, said his mother's name and watched the woman come apart and got from her, perhaps, some scrap of the past worth having. He let it go. A man who breaks open everyone who shows him a seam ends his days alone in a house full of broken people, and he had been most of the way to that man once at the end of the other life. What was she like? He asked instead, plain, a child asking after something he was owed. Petunia took her hand off the plate and turned to the sink. "Clever," she said, "too clever, always was." And that was the whole of it, and it was more than she had given him in 10 years, and he ate his dinner and put none of it on the ledger, because some things did not belong there. And he made a plan for the dark things on his list, which meant first solving a problem he had never had to think about clearly the first time, because the first time other people had done the thinking and he had only swung the weapon. How do you kill a piece of a soul? He laid the Dark Artifacts book open on the floor one night and read what little it dared to say, and filled in the rest from memory, and the memory was hard-won and exact. A Horcrux did not die by ordinary means. You could not burn it or smash it or curse it back into silence. The container had to be damaged past any magic's power to repair, and there were only a handful of things in the world that did that kind of damage. Fiendfire, the cursed flame that hunted and devoured and could not be called off once loosed, which had killed a friend of a friend in a room of lost things, and which Harry would not light if there were any other way, and there was. The venom of a basilisk, which destroyed past repair and against which only one thing in the castle stood proof. And a blade that had drunk that venom and kept it, a goblin-wrought sword that took into itself only that which made it stronger, which lived, when it chose to, in a particular hat. There was a basilisk under the school. He knew the way down to it, the words to open the door, the manner of its death and the trick that beat it. There was a sword that would come to a true Gryffindor in need. There were, in other words, within the walls of the castle he was about to enter, both the poison and the blade that could unmake every cursed object on his list, sitting and waiting in the dark for someone who knew they were there. He would go down to the chamber early. He would take the fangs. With the fangs or the sword he could destroy the ring and the locket and the cup and the diadem and the diary, every vessel but the one in his own head, and that last one he set aside for now because it needed a different kind of solving, and he had a whole year to find it. The one in his own head was the piece that had killed him the first time, and he turned it over now in the dark with the cold attention a man gives to the round that has his name written on it. The splinter behind his scar could not be cut out with a fang. The fang would kill its host along with it. It could not be starved or sealed or talked round. The first time the only key anyone had found was the worst one a mind could hold, that the fragment would die if Harry did, that he had to walk unresisting into a curse and let Voldemort perform the surgery with his own wand. It had worked after a fashion on the strength of an accident of blood and sacrifice that no one living had fully understood, and it had left him breathing but marked, the war won and the weapon spent, and the order had finished in a ruined hall what the forest had left undone. There was a better way. There had to be. He did not have it yet, but he had the shape of the question, and the shape of a question is most of the work of answering it. Somewhere between the protection his mother had hung in his blood and the strange double death he had survived in that white nowhere lay a method that did not end with him lying down to die for it a second time. He had a year and the books and his own exact memory of how the fragment moved and fed, and a goblin who knew curse work, and the thing he had never once been granted the first time, which was room to think. He would find it. Until he found it, he would keep the scar quiet, keep the wraith from ever drawing near enough to feel its own reflection looking back, and hunt the other 6 pieces down one cold night at a time. He wrote none of it down. Plans written down could be read by other people, and he meant to keep this one entirely behind his own eyes. He held it as he held everything now, in the house in his mind, in a room with a strong door. He thought, too, about being watched because he was, and had been every day of this second childhood, whether or not he could see the watchers. There was a woman 3 streets over, a tired old soul with too many cats and a smell of boiled cabbage about her house, who had minded him 100 times as a child, and whom he had pitied then for her dullness. She was no muggle. She was a squib born to magic and given none of it, set on Privet Drive years ago to keep watch over the famous orphan and to send word, by owl or by stranger means, to a certain office in a certain tower. He had learned this far too late the first time. He knew it now, and he was careful, every time he passed her gate, to be exactly the listless, unremarkable child her reports described, because the reports traveled up the line, and the line ended in a pair of half-moon spectacles, and those were the one pair of eyes in the world he most needed to keep fooled. That was the hardest stretch of the road in front of him, and he made himself look at it without flinching. Dumbledore was not a fool. Dumbledore was the cleverest person Harry had ever known, and the most patient and the gentlest to look upon, and he had spun at Hogwarts a web of watching so fine that Harry had moved around inside it for years and never once felt a thread. The portraits gossiped, the ghosts drifted through walls, the house elves saw everything and told whatever they were asked to tell. The old man knew most days where every child in his castle was and roughly what each was about, and he steered them all with a touch so light it passed for luck. Harry was about to walk back into that web as the one thing it had never been built to hold, a child who already knew its every strand. The rules, then, written nowhere but behind his own eyes. Cast nothing a first year could not cast in front of anyone who might carry the tale upward. Make the friendships he meant to make in the open, so they read as a lonely child finding his feet and not as a soldier assembling a unit. Do the dark and necessary work in the dark, alone, on nights chosen for their cover, and above all, give Dumbledore an orphan to dote on. Let the old man find in Harry precisely the child he had spent 10 careful years building, brave and warm and a little reckless, and starved for the approval of the grandfather he had never had, and let him steer that child with his light, kind, ruinous hand, and never once feel the hand close on empty air. Once on a warm night near the end of August with the window open and the owl awake on the wardrobe, he sat on the floor and let himself take out, deliberately, the names, not the boots. He had looked at the boots already on the rock and sealed them away. The other names, the ones he meant to save, Ron, and how he laughed before he thought better of it. Hermione, in the particular set of her jaw when she had decided she was right and you were not. Fred and George, indistinguishable and unbearable, and one of them gone behind a wall that fell. The twins were 4 years old tonight. Ginny was 10 and at home and would be on the platform in a year, small and fierce and not yet anyone's. He held each of them up in the dark and looked at them as he had looked at the boots, not to drown but to fix the stakes, to remind himself exactly what he was playing for, and then he set them down too, carefully, behind the door with the rest, and switched off the torch. Hedwig, he said into the dark, trying the name, and the owl turned her pale face toward him and made a low sound in her throat, and the name fit her the way the wand had fit his hand, the way some things do when you give them back to the world a second time. All right, he said. Hedwig, let's do it properly this time. She watched him with her winter eyes and said nothing, which was the answer he wanted, and outside the window the suburban night ticked over toward September, and the scarlet train that would carry him back to the start of everything stood waiting at the far end of one more week. Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. The hat and the long game. The barrier between platforms 9 and 10 swallowed him whole, and he came out the other side into steam and noise and the long scarlet flank of the Hogwarts Express, and for a moment Harry stood still on the crowded platform and let the sighs of it land. He had not come here to be moved, he had come to choose. But the engine breathed its white breath over 100 families saying their goodbyes, and somewhere in that crowd were the 3 people he had crossed a death to find, and the cold machinery in him paused just once to watch them be alive. He found the Weasleys by their hair, a moving knot of red against the gray morning, a harried plump woman shepherding a clutch of sons toward the train. He knew every one of them, the twins, taller than he had braced for, shoving each other, and a trunk in roughly equal measure. Percy, polished and self-important and breathing, and the youngest of the boys, gangling and freckled, looking up at the train with the open uncertainty of a child who has never been anywhere, a smudge of something on his nose that no one had thought to tell him about. Ron. The grief went through Harry and out the other side before it reached his face, because he had rehearsed exactly this, the sight of a dead friend restored to a railway platform, and he had promised himself he would not waste the moment standing slack-jawed in a crowd. He took the picture of Ron alive and set it carefully where he kept the things worth keeping, and then he did the practical thing, which was to plant himself with his trunk and his owl, near enough to the Weasleys that the rest would happen on its own. It happened on its own. He wrestled with his trunk at a carriage door, which was true, the body being 11 and the trunk being heavy, and the plump woman's voice said, "Need a hand, dear." And then the twins were there, Fred and George, hauling the trunk up between them with a practiced heave, and one of them caught sight of his forehead and went still. "Blimey," said the one on the left. "Are you?" "He is," said the one on the right. "Harry Potter," Harry agreed, because there was no use denying it and great use in being easy about it, and he put out his hand and shook each of theirs in turn, fixing which was which by a thin scar on Fred's knuckle that George did not have, so that he would never again in this life mix up the two of them as he had for years in the last. One of them would not see 20 in the world Harry was unmaking. He meant to know them apart while he still had both. He ended up sharing a compartment with Ron because Ron came looking for a seat and found Harry in one, and because Harry, who could have engineered a dozen more useful first acquaintances, wanted this one most and wanted it to look like luck. The freckled boy hovered in the doorway. "Anyone sitting there, everywhere else is full." "Sit down," Harry said, and Ron sat, and there it was, the beginning of the only brotherhood Harry had ever had, started over from nothing in a swaying carriage, and the strangeness of it was a weight he carried lightly because he had decided he would. He let Ron talk. That was the whole trick of Ron the first time, and now. He had grown up the sixth of 7 sons, always in someone's shadow, always certain he was the least interesting person in any room, and the kindest and most binding thing you could do for him was to find him interesting. So Harry asked about the family, the brothers, Charlie's dragons in Romania and Bill's curse-breaking in Egypt, and watched the freckled face open like a window thrown wide. He did not have to counterfeit the warmth, because the warmth was real and old and had survived a war and a death to arrive here intact. Ron offered him a squashed corned beef sandwich his mother had made wrong, and Harry took it and ate half before handing it back, and when the trolley came rattling down the corridor he bought out a sweep of it and tipped the spoils into the seat between them, and these were small things, and they were the footings under everything he meant to build. The girl came looking for a toad. She slid the compartment door open with a boy in tow, a round-faced anxious child grasping at the empty air where a pet should have been, and she had a great deal of brown hair and front teeth a fraction too large, and the unmistakable carriage of someone who had read all her schoolbooks twice and intended you to know it. Has anyone seen a toad? Neville's lost one. Hermione Granger. 11 years old, friendless and bossy, and already half-sick with the certainty that this new world would find her wanting, armoring herself in facts because facts were the one thing no one could take from her. Harry knew precisely who she would become, and precisely how she would die in the last life, holding a doorway against 3 Death Eaters while a column of younger students fled past her toward the boats. She knew none of it. She knew she had lost a boy's toad and meant to find it. "We haven't seen it," Harry said, "but I'll help you look in a minute. I'm Harry. This is Ron. What's your name?" She blinked, thrown clean off whatever brisk officious speech she had prepared. People did not, as a rule, offer to help her. "Hermione Granger," she said, "and you're Harry Potter. I know all about you. You're in modern magical history and the rise and fall of the dark arts, and it probably says I'm taller," Harry said. "Don't believe everything you read." Ron snorted into a pumpkin pasty, and the round-faced boy in the doorway gave a wet, anxious laugh, and Hermione's careful armor slipped half an inch, and under it was a lonely, clever child who badly wanted to be liked and had no idea how to ask. "Sit down a minute," Harry said. "Both of you will find the toad. Neville, is it? What's he look like, your toad?" He got the toad's description and a foothold in 2 more lives. Neville Longbottom sat where he was told and folded his hands in his lap and watched Harry with the wariness of a child braced for a joke at his expense that did not come. He was soft and timid now, this boy whose parents lay in a hospital ward with their minds tortured out of them, who had been handed a war hero's blood and none of the steadiness to carry it. Harry had watched him take the head off a snake with a sword in front of the massed forces of the Dark Lord. Looked at the trembling child across the compartment and saw who was waiting inside him, and decided then and there that this time Neville would not have to find that person alone and in the dark and far too late. "You'll be fine, you know," Harry told him low, while Ron and Hermione bickered amiably over a chocolate frog card. "At school, you're worried you won't be. You will." Neville stared. "How do you know?" "I don't know much," Harry said. "I'm good at picking people, though, and I picked right with you." It was the kind of thing you said to a child to prop him up, and Neville heard it that way and sat a little straighter, and did not understand that it was a debt being entered on a ledger and paid in advance. The door slid open one more time, and Draco Malfoy stood in it with 2 large vacant boys behind him, and his eyes went straight to Harry. "They're saying all up the train it's Harry Potter in this compartment," he said, and put out a pale hand. "You'll soon find some wizarding families are better than others, Potter. You don't want to go making friends with the wrong sort. I can help you there." The first time Harry had looked at Ron beside him, freckled and poor and proud, and understood the pale hand as the insult to his new friend that it was, and had refused it and made an enemy for 7 years. He understood the moment better now. Draco was not offering friendship. He was offering a hierarchy, his father's hierarchy. Malfoy's near the top and Weasley's near the bottom, and the price of the hand was agreement to the map. Harry had no intention of agreeing to the map. He had no intention either of manufacturing at 11 in a train corridor an enemy he might rather keep as a wavering neutral down the long years to come. I think I can pick my own sort, thanks, Harry said easily without heat, looking at the hand and not taking it. No offense. I like to make up my own mind about people. He let it sit a beat, then added, milder still, yours included. Which was not a rejection of Draco so much as a refusal of his map, and Draco, who had braced for the loud public scorn his father had trained him to provoke and feed on, found himself with a hand held out to a boy who had declined it politely and complimented him sideways in the same breath, and had nothing in his script for that. He took the hand back. He muttered something about hoping Potter knew what he was doing, mixing with riffraff, and went, and the air he left was not the cold air of a ward declared. Harry had spent nothing and closed no doors. Doors stayed cheapest when you left them ajar. I can't believe you were almost nice to him, Ron said, scandalized. I wasn't nice to him, Harry said. I was nothing to him. There's a difference. He'll work it out eventually. And he turned the talk to Quidditch before Ron could ask what he meant, because the answer lived 3 years in a tower and a fire away, and not in a swaying carriage in September. The castle came up out of the dark across the black water of the lake, towers and lit windows stacked against the stars, and the gasp went up from the little fleet of boats, and Harry let himself look at it the way the others did, because it deserved looking at, and because a person who fails to look at Hogwarts rising out of the night has mislaid something he ought to guard. He had bled in those corridors. He had died after a fashion in a forest at their edge. He had also been happier inside those walls than anywhere else in either life, and both of those were true, and he held them both, and stepped out of the boat onto the rock at the foot of the great stair with his eyes open. Professor McGonagall met them at the top, square-shouldered and severe in emerald robes, and gave the speech about the 4 houses he had heard once before, and led them through the great doors into the hall with its long tables and its 1,000 floating candles, and its ceiling bewitched to mirror the sky. On a stool at the front sat the Sorting Hat, ancient and patched and frayed at the brim, and Harry looked at it across the heads of the crowd, and the cold part of him came fully awake because the hat was the first real hazard of the night. The hat read minds. It had to sort. It would go down into his head, and it would find there not a child's clean slate but a war, a death, a list of murders not yet committed, the whole black architecture of a future no 11-year-old had any business holding. There was no hiding the house behind his eyes from a thing that lived by reading houses behind eyes. So Harry had decided on the train not to hide it at all. He would do the other thing. He would talk to it. The hat sang its song. The names began alphabetically, and the children went up one by one and sat and were sorted, and Harry watched and waited and kept his place in his mind held open and ready. Granger Hermione went to the stool rigid, gripping its edge with white knuckles, and the hat sat over her eyes a long moment before it called Gryffindor, and Harry let go a breath he had not advertised holding, because he had not been certain this time, with everything subtly shifted off its first course, that she would land where she belonged. She had, good. Longbottom Neville took longer still, the hat muttering to itself, and then Gryffindor again, and Neville bolted with the hat still on his head and had to run it back, scarlet to the ears, and Harry watched him stumble and felt the old protectiveness settle into its socket like a stone. Malfoy Draco was a Slytherin before the hat had well touched his pale hair. Potter Harry, when it came, dropped a hush over the hall like a cloth thrown over a cage. He heard the whispers run, Potter, did she say Potter, the Harry Potter, and he walked up between the staring tables at the unhurried pace of a man who has been stared at by larger and worse crowds, and sat, and McGonagall lowered the hat over his eyes and the world went dark and a small dry voice spoke inside his skull. Well, well, said the hat, now this is something I have never met before. Harry did not answer aloud. He thought it plainly in the front room of the house in his mind, the room he kept furnished for visitors. I know, look all you like, but know first that I know what you are bound by. Bound, the hat repeated, interested. You mean the old enchantment, that I speak to no one what I read in a sorting. That is so, it has always been so. 1,000 years of secrets, child, and not one of them ever spoken outside the head it came from. A pause, and Harry felt the thing turn over inside him like a reader flicking pages, faster and faster, the war, the dead, the green light, the white nowhere, the cold arithmetic of a life lived twice. Merlin's beard, the hat said quietly. You poor creature, you have done all of this once already. I have, Harry thought, and I mean to do it again better. I need a house that lets me move. I need to be where the people I am protecting will be, and where the eyes that watch me expect to find me. Slytherin would suit the mind you have grown into, the hat mused. Oh, it would suit it beautifully. Cunning you have in surplus now, ambition of the coldest kind. You would do great things from the green table and terrible ones, and no one would think to stop you until far too late. Harry felt it weighing him, truly weighing the way it had the first time, only now under the full freight of what he carried. But you do not want greatness, the hat said slower. You want to keep some specific people breathing, and you have decided to let those few people matter to you in the open as your cover, and that is a Gryffindor's bargain if ever I sorted one. The brave thing tucked inside the clever thing. Very well. Will you keep my secret? Harry thought. All of it. I keep every secret, the hat said with what might have been dignity. It is the only thing I am for. But I will give you one word before I send you on, since you are the strangest head I have worn in 1,000 years, and you have earned it. It dropped its voice, though there was no one in the world who could overhear a voice inside a skull. The hardest enemy you face is not the one with the red eyes. You have his measure already. It is the one with the blue, the kind one, the one you cannot stop loving even now while you sit here planning against him. Guard what you cherish. Do not let the planning eat it. Anyone who wins your war by becoming the thing that began it has lost it. Now then. And aloud to the hall in its great carrying voice, the hat cried, Gryffindor. The red table came apart in cheering. Harry lifted the hat off and handed it back to McGonagall and went down into the noise, and the twins were chanting, we got Potter, and Ron, sorted to the same table a few names later, dropped into the seat at his side grinning like the sunrise, and Hermione shifted to make room and Neville beamed from across the boards, and Harry sat among the four of them with the racket washing over him and let himself have it, the small clean fact of being surrounded, for one night, by people he had buried and brought back to the table. He would spend the rest of the year laboring in the dark to keep them above the ground. Tonight he ate the feast and laughed at the twins and was, very nearly, an ordinary boy among ordinary boys, and the nearness of the thing was its own slow ache. He used the feast, as he had used the Lakey, to read the room. Dumbledore sat at the center of the staff table in robes the color of a kingfisher's wing, beaming over his half-moon spectacles at the assembled school, his white beard tucked into his belt, the very portrait of a benevolent grandfather presiding over 1,000 grandchildren. Harry watched him without appearing to, and found, behind the twinkle, exactly what he had come braced to find. The stillness of a mind that never stopped working, eyes that moved across the hall counting and weighing and filing, and the particular attention they paid twice, 3 times, to the new Gryffindor at the end of the table who had been sorted faster than anyone expected, and was eating his treacle tart with a composure that did not quite fit a child of 11. Harry felt the attention land each time, and each time made sure it found a delighted boy gawking up at the bewitched ceiling, and the attention moved on and came back and moved on. The long game had begun then. The first player had already noticed there was something not entirely childlike about the piece at the end of the red table. Let him notice, Harry thought, and helped himself to more potatoes. Noticing was not knowing. A man could spend years noticing and never once guess the truth, because the truth was too strange to be guessed, and Dumbledore's one great weakness, the flaw that had killed Harry the first time, was that he always believed his own theory of a person was the real person. Harry meant to hand him a theory he liked the shape of. When Dumbledore rose for the start of term notices, Harry listened with the rest and heard the warning come, light and almost merry, that the third-floor corridor on the right-hand side was out of bounds to anyone who did not wish to die a most painful death. A ripple of uneasy laughter ran the hall. The old man's eyes swept the students as he said it, and Harry made certain his own face wore the same blend of thrill and fright as every other first year's, and underneath it he thought, there it is, the bait. A locked door and a death dressed up as a joke, calibrated to draw exactly the brave, curious, reckless boy the old man had spent 10 years cultivating straight toward the trap that would teach him his destiny. The first time it had worked beautifully. Harry had gone to the 3rd floor. Harry had met the Wraith. Harry had been shaped by the meeting into the weapon the headmaster needed. This time Harry would go to the 3rd floor too, on his own clock, through his own door, and the shaping would not run the way the carpenter had planned it. The sallow man 2 seats down from Dumbledore caught his eye then, hook-nosed and curtained in greasy black hair, looking the length of the hall at the Gryffindor table with an expression of settled distaste. Severus Snape. Harry's scar gave a flicker, the old reflex, but it was not Snape that woke it. It was the turbaned figure beside Snape, Quirrell, whose passenger had turned its dim attention toward the child it had marked years ago, and the thin pain that came was the Wraith's doing, not the spy's. The first time, Harry had blamed Snape for that pain and hated him on the strength of the misread. He did not misread now. He looked at Snape and made himself remember on purpose the thing he had learned only at the very end, that this bitter, cruel, brilliant teacher had loved Harry's mother since they were both children, had turned spy and lived a double life of unimaginable strain for 16 years to keep her son alive, had died with her name in his mouth, had been braver and more alone than anyone in the whole long war. Harry had spat on that bravery for years out of pure ignorance. He would not bait him this time. He would not hand him the arrogant Potter sneer that confirmed every bitter old memory and made it easy to despise the son for the sins of the father. He held the dark eyes across the hall a moment level, and inclined his head, the smallest courtesy, the kind you offer a man whose worth you know, and whose grief you do not intend to add to. Snape's lip began its accustomed curl, expecting insolence, finding none, and the curl faltered, and for a moment he had no expression ready at all, and he looked away first, which Harry had not intended but did not mind. One more piece read correctly. One more relationship to be built on a foundation other than the wreckage of the last. The feast ended. Percy marched the Gryffindor first years up the shifting staircases to the portrait of the fat lady and the round common room with its fire and its overstuffed armchairs, and the boys climbed the last stair to the dormitory under the eaves, where 5 four-posters stood waiting beneath red hangings. Ron was asleep within minutes, and Neville within a few more, and Harry lay in the bed that had been his the first time, in the room that had been his the first time, and listened to the breathing of boys he had outlived, and did not sleep. When the dormitory had settled into the deep, even rhythm of sleep, he drew his curtains close and went to work, first the house. He walked its rooms in his mind one by one, as he did every night, checking the doors, making sure the war stayed locked behind them and the orphan stayed furnished out front. Dumbledore had looked at him 3 times tonight. Snape would look harder, professionally, in the first potions lesson, and Snape was a legilimens of genuine skill. Quirrell's passenger would brush him in every defense class through the year. He could afford no slips at all. He walked the house twice and found every door sound, then the plan. He took it out and laid it flat in the dark, the chamber first. It had to come first because everything downstream of it depended on the fangs. He knew the entrance, a sink in a disused girl's bathroom on the 2nd floor that no one went near because a sullen ghost had claimed it for her own. He knew the password, which was no word at all but a sound, the hiss of parcel tongue he still carried, a gift left in him by the very fragment he meant one day to cut out. He knew what waited at the bottom, a basilisk 60 feet of it, lethal to any gaze that met its own, killable by a cockerel's crow it would never hear so far down, and by a sword whose bite it had not yet tasted. He had killed it once with that sword at 12, wounded and poisoned and lucky past any reason. He meant to kill it this time at 11, unwounded and unlucky and prepared, and to walk out with a satchel of fangs that would unmake 6 pieces of a torn soul. It was, he allowed himself to admit in the honest dark, close to insane. A first year going down alone into the lair of a 1,000-year-old serpent. But he was no first year, whatever his hands insisted, and the serpent's every advantage was an advantage only over someone who did not know it was there, and Harry knew all of it. The size, the blindness it could not inflict on a downturned gaze, the way it moved, the exact place the blade had gone in. The only true danger was the eyes, and there were ways of handling eyes that did not depend on cleverness in the moment, ways he could prepare days ahead, with mirrors and with the plain discipline of looking only at the floor. He turned the approach over and over until it had no soft place left in it, and then he set a date 3 weeks out, after he had re-established his fluency with a wand in lessons and drawn the well of his magic up as far as another month of breathing would carry it. On the first Saturday he scouted it. He told Ron and Hermione he wanted to find the library, which was true enough, and peeled off alone on the way back, and let his feet carry him to the 2nd-floor bathroom no living student would willingly enter. It was as he remembered, cold and dripping and out of order, the taps gone green with disuse, a cracked mirror over the basins, and the sullen, translucent shape of the girl who haunted it drifting near the ceiling. Moaning Myrtle had died here 50 years ago, killed by the very thing that slept below, looking through a crack in a cubicle door at a pair of great yellow eyes. Harry did not disturb her. He found the basin he wanted, and the small snake scratched into the side of one copper tap, the one tap that did not run, the door to the deep place. He stood a moment in the wet cold and listened to the pipes, and somewhere far down below, hearing something old turned over in its sleep and did not wake. 3 weeks, he had 3 weeks to be ready, and a serpent to kill, and a whole second life riding on doing alone what had nearly killed him with help. That left the days between, and the days between had their own work. The first week of lessons Harry treated as a problem in deception. He had to relearn in public the spells his grown hands already knew, and he had to relearn them at a believable rate, fast enough to be talented and slow enough to be a child. In Transfiguration, McGonagall set them to turning a match into a needle, and Harry got a silvering of the match by the end of the hour and a fully formed needle only on the 3rd lesson, when Hermione had managed hers too, and the achievement would draw no special notice. He could have done it in his sleep with his eyes shut. He let it take 3 lessons and earned McGonagall's brisk approval and nothing more, and that was exactly the amount of attention he wanted from the head of his house. In charms it was the same, a careful performance of ordinary aptitude. He hung back half a step behind Hermione in everything that could be measured, partly to keep his cover and partly because the friendship was worth more than the marks, and a girl who had spent her whole short life being resented for being clever did not need the famous boy outshining her in her one safe arena. He let her be first. He asked her sometimes how she had done a thing, and watched her light up at being asked, and the unit knit itself a little tighter each day, Ron and Hermione and Neville and Harry, 4 desks in a row, the small fellowship he was building under cover of being a lonely boy who had finally found some friends. Potions was the test he had braced for. Snape swept into the dungeon in his black robes and called the register, pausing at Harry's name with the old theatrical contempt. Our new celebrity, and Harry met it with a flat, polite attention and gave him nothing to work with. Then the questions came, fired one after another, the ones designed to humiliate a first-year who could not possibly know the answers. Powdered root of asphodel and an infusion of wormhood, a bezoar, monkshood, and wolfsbane. Harry knew every answer. He had brewed half these potions in a war, under worse pressure than a sneering teacher. The temptation was there, old and familiar, to fire the answers back and watch Snape fail to land the blow. He did not. He answered the first question correctly and quietly, eyes down, and to the second he said, "A bezoar, sir, it's a stone from a goat's stomach, it'll save you from most poisons." And to the third the same, plain and accurate and entirely without challenge, a boy who had clearly read his book and was trying not to seem proud of it. He let Hermione's hand wave in the air beside him and did not compete with it. He took the point Snape grudgingly could not withhold and offered no flourish to resent. Snape watched him through the rest of the lesson with a flicker of something that was not quite his usual loathing, because the script he had carried into that dungeon for years required an arrogant, careless, attention-seeking boy in the image of a man he had hated, and the child in front of him was careful and quiet and deferential, and gave the old grudge nothing to bite on. Once, near the end, the dark eyes settled on Harry's and pressed, lightly, the way a Legilimen's presses, testing. Harry felt it come and held the front room open and let him look. Snape found a nervous first-year concentrating on his cauldron, frightened of getting the brew wrong, thinking about nothing more dangerous than the correct moment to add the porcupine quills. He found, in other words, exactly the unremarkable child the surface was built to show him, and the pressure withdrew, baffled, and Harry stirred his potion and added the quills off the heat, and kept his hand steady on the rod. Defense against the dark arts was the last to come, and Harry walked into Quirrell's garlic-reeking classroom on the Thursday with the house shut tight and the scar braced for what it would do. It did it. The moment Quirrell turned from the board in his eyes, and the eyes behind his eyes found the marked child in the third row, the needle of heat slid in behind Harry's own eye and stayed. He sat through the stammering, useless lesson and let the pain be only pain, information and nothing more, and used the hour to study his enemy at close range. The host was failing already, gray and sweating under the turban, eaten from within. The passenger was patient and starving, and entirely fixed on a stone behind a mirror it could not reach. Neither of them, looking at the quiet child taking careful notes in the third row, had the first idea that the child was looking back, measuring the host's decline and the passenger's hunger in the precise week, somewhere in the cold heart of the coming term when both would be ripe to take. The flying lesson came on the second Thursday, the Gryffindor and Slytherin first years together on the windswept lawn with 2 rows of battered school brooms laid out in the grass. Harry had loved flying once, cleanly, the one thing in the whole magical world that had ever felt like freedom rather than a fight. He found he loved it still under everything, and that the loving of it was one more thing he would have to ration. Madame Hooch had them stick out a hand and call the brooms up. Harry's leapt to his palm at once, because brooms answer confidence and he had nothing else, and he fumbled the grip afterward so that the leap read as luck. Beside him, Neville's broom rolled over in the grass and would not rise, and Harry watched the certainty of failure build in the round face, the thing that was Neville's worst enemy, worse than any broom. "Don't grip so hard," Harry said under his breath. "Open your hand, ask it, don't order it." Neville opened his hand and the broom came up, and the plain astonishment on his face was worth more to the long campaign than any spell Harry could have thrown. It went wrong anyway, the way it had the first time, because some grooves in the world ran deep. Neville, nervous and overcorrecting, pushed off too hard before the whistle and shot up sideways, slipping, white at the knuckles, and Harry was already moving. He had no broom under him and no time to mount one, but he had a wand in his sleeve and a month of relearned fluency in his hands, and as Neville lost his grip and began to drop, Harry brought the wand up low against his hip, hidden from the watching Slytherins, and breathed the cushioning charm he had cast 1,000 times in a war over comrades thrown by curses. The air beneath Neville thickened for the last few feet, so that what should have snapped a wrist only drove the wind out of him and left him gasping in the grass hole. Madame Hooch came running and found a fallen boy who was somehow unhurt, and put it down to luck in the soft autumn ground, and Harry let her, sliding the wand back up his sleeve before her eyes came round. Draco Malfoy, who the first time had snatched up the fallen boy's dropped Remembrall and led Harry on the chase that made his Quidditch career, found the glass ball in the grass now and turned it over, hunting for the cruelty in it, and looked up to find Harry watching him with a flat, patient, unimpressed attention that had nothing of a child in it at all. "Give it back, Malfoy," Harry said, not loud, not a dare, a statement about how the next minute was going to go. And Draco, braced for heat and noise and a chase he would win, met instead a pair of green eyes that had plainly already watched the end of this game and every other he might start, and something in him quietly declined a contest it could not name. He dropped the remembrall into Harry's hand and walked off muttering, and the moment that had made Harry a seeker the first time simply did not arrive, and Harry found he did not mind it. There would be other ways to fly. Glory was a spotlight, and he had work that wanted the dark. On the Sunday, he took tea with Hagrid in the hut at the edge of the forest, because the friendship was real and a man keeps his real things tended, and because Hagrid, who could not keep a secret to save his own life, was the loosest thread in Dumbledore's whole careful weave. They sat with rock cakes that could have cracked teeth and a fire too big for the room, and Hagrid talked, and Harry steered gently, the way you steer a large, friendly animal, with the lightest pressure and a great deal of patience. He learned what he already knew and wanted confirmed, that a three-headed dog named Fluffy was lodged behind the forbidden door, that Hagrid had lent the beast to Dumbledore to guard something top secret, Hogwarts and Nicholas Flamel's business and no one else's, and that Hagrid, having said the name, went purple and swore Harry to forget he had heard it. Harry promised to forget it and remembered it exactly and drank his tea, and let Hagrid ruffle his hair and call him the spit of his father, and walked back up in the grey afternoon with one more confirmation set where it belonged and a warmth he let himself, on the walk, simply feel. He went a fortnight like that, an ordinary, brilliant, unremarkable first year, before Dumbledore made his first move. It came on a Friday evening in a corridor near the library, and it came dressed, the way all the old man's moves came dressed, as a happy accident. Harry was walking back to the tower alone, having sent the others on, when a voice behind him said, "Ah, Harry," the very person, and there he was, Albus Dumbledore, ambling along the corridor as though chance had simply set them in the same stone hallway at the same hour, which Harry did not for 1 second believe. "Good evening, Professor," Harry said, and gave him the open, slightly odd face of a first year unexpectedly addressed by the headmaster. "Settling in, are you?" The blue eyes twinkled down at him over the spectacles, mild and warm and very, very attentive. "Your parents would be so proud to see you here. I knew them, you know, Lily and James. I confess I have been wondering how their son was finding the place. It was beautifully done." The mention of the parents to see whether the child's face would crumple or hunger for more. The casual claim of intimacy, "I knew them," to plant the headmaster as the bridge to a family the child had never had. Harry watched the whole apparatus deploy and felt under his cold attention the old pull of it, the longing of the orphaned child he had been, who would have given anything for this kind old man to talk to him about his mother. He let exactly that longing show, because it was real and because it was the page the old man had come to read, and he asked in a small voice, "Did you really know my mum?" And Dumbledore told him a small true thing about Lily, something gentle, and watched the child drink it, and Harry drank it and let his eyes shine and gave the headmaster the precise picture he had come for. A lonely, loving, slightly dazzled child, brave and warm and a little reckless, starved for exactly this. He saw the old man find that picture and approve of it and tuck it away, satisfied, the theory confirmed. They walked a little way together. Dumbledore asked a few light questions that were not light at all, about his friends, about his lessons, about whether he had been exploring the castle, and Harry answered each of them as the child in the picture would answer and let slip nothing. And when they parted at the foot of the tower stair, the old man laid a light hand on his shoulder and said, "My door is always open to you, Harry." Always, which Harry understood to mean, "I am watching, and I would like you to bring your secrets to me yourself." "Thank you, Professor," Harry said, and climbed the stair, and did not let anything cross his face until the portrait had swung shut behind him. In the dormitory, behind his drawn curtains, he sat in the dark and walked the house once more, door by door, and found it sound. The old man had looked and looked hard with all the gentle, terrible skill he owned, and had come away with the orphan and nothing else. The deception held. It would have to keep holding, lesson after lesson, evening after evening, for as long as the long game ran. He lay back at last, and through the gap in the curtains he could see a slice of the enchanted window and one cold star burning in it, and he let the grief come up one final time before sleep, not for anyone in particular tonight, only the general weight of the thing, the boys breathing around him who were alive because the war had not yet been allowed to happen, the whole impossible labor of keeping them so. He let it move through him and recede. Then he slept lightly, half an ear open, in a castle full of people who loved him and watched him and would, every one of them, have been struck speechless to learn what the small dark-haired boy in the corner bed was planning to do before the leaves had finished coming down. Chapter 3 and Chapter 4. Venom. He went down on a Tuesday in late October, in the dead hour after the castle had finally gone quiet, because Tuesdays were the night the prefect's patrols ran thinnest, and because he had waited as long as patience allowed, and the body would carry him no further into readiness than it had already come. The preparation had taken 3 weeks and looked, to anyone watching, like nothing. He had drawn the well of his magic up by daily inches until a first year's channels ran deeper than any first year had a right to. He had relearned, in the locked privacy of the dormitory with the curtains drawn and a muffliato laid over them, the spells he meant to need. The severing charm honed fine, the shield he could throw without a word, the cushioning charm, the simple steady lumos that would not gutter when his hand was busy with other things. He had practiced casting with his eyes shut, until aiming by sound and sense came back to his fingers, because the one thing he could not afford in the place he was going was to look up. And he had taken 2 nights before a young cockerel from the wire run behind Hagrid's hut, lifting it sleeping from the roost with a hand over its beak, and carrying it back to the castle inside his robes, where it now rode in a sack at his hip, drugged faintly calm with a few drops of the sleeping draught he had brewed for exactly this. A basilisk feared 2 things in all the world. One was the crowing of a rooster, which stopped its ancient heart. Harry had brought the rooster. He did not intend to fight the serpent at all if he could help it. He intended to execute it. Myrtle's bathroom was cold and dripping and empty, the ghost gone wherever ghosts went in the small hours. Harry crossed to the bank of sinks, found the copper tap with the snake scratched into its side, and looked at it a moment in the wandlight. Then he let the other language rise in him, the one that lived behind his scar, the gift of the thing he meant to spend the night arming himself against, and he hissed at the tap the word that was not a word, the word for open. The sink glowed white and began to move. The tap spun, the basin sank, and where it had been a wide, dark pipe yawned down into the rock, slick and round and falling away into nothing. Harry checked the sack at his hip, checked the satchel on his back, took a breath of the cold, wet air, and went down feet first into the dark. The slide was long and filthy, a plunge through pipe after branching pipe, down past the dungeons, down past whatever lay below the dungeons, down into the bedrock the castle stood on, and he kept his arms in and his chin down and rode it as he had ridden the cart at Gringotts, steady, counting, until the pipe leveled and spat him out onto the floor of a stone tunnel far below the school. He came up on his feet. He cast a slow circle of light around him and found the tunnel he remembered, low and dripping, the floor littered with the small bones of things that had wandered in and not wandered out, the curved ceiling lost in shadow. He went forward carefully, the wand low and steady, and the first true test of his preparation came around a bend in the tunnel. The shed skin of the serpent, 20-odd feet of it, vivid poison green, lying coiled and translucent across the whole width of the passage. He had braced for it, and it still stopped him in his tracks, because the skin gave the measure of the thing in a way that memory had let go soft. The creature that had grown out of that and grown since was the length of 3 school corridors and old beyond reckoning, and he was 11 and alone with a sack and a sword he did not have and a plan he had told no living soul. He stood over the skin a moment and let the size of the danger be real to him, because a man who lies to himself about the size of a danger dies of the lie, and then he stepped over the skin and went on, because the danger being real changed nothing about what had to be done. The deeper he went, the colder it grew, and the older the air tasted, mineral and dead, the breath of a place that had not been opened in 50 years and had been opened only rarely in 1,000. He passed under arches carved with serpents worn nearly smooth, past side passages that breathed darkness at him, and he kept his light low and his ears open. Once he stopped entirely and stood still for a full minute because he had heard, or thought he had heard, far ahead and far below, the slow, heavy drag of something enormous shifting its weight in its sleep. He waited until the sound did not come again. Then he went on, because waiting only let the cold into his hands, and cold hands cast badly, and tonight of all nights his hands had to be sure. The end of the tunnel was a wall of solid stone carved with 2 entwined serpents, their eyes set with great glittering emeralds, and Harry stopped before it and made himself ready in the particular way the next minutes demanded. He would not be able to look. From the moment the door opened, he would have to keep his eyes off the thing, off its body even, because a glimpse of the eyes in a reflection in the wet sheen of a wall was enough. He had thought hard about how a man fights what he cannot look at, and the answer was that he does not fight it. He sets a trap and springs it and lets the trap do the looking. He had a second plan folded behind the first, because a man who goes into the dark with only one plan has already decided how he will die. If the cockerel failed, if the draught had left it too dull to crow or the throw went wide, he would fall back on the old discipline, eyes shut, casting by sound, the severing charm thrown again and again at the noise of the thing until either it died or he did. He had rehearsed that too in the curtained dark until he could put a blind, cutting curse within a foot of a sound across a room. It was a worse plan. It ended more often than he liked, with a 60-foot serpent finding a blind child by the taste of the air. He kept it behind the first plan the way you keep a knife behind a wand, hoping never to reach for it. He took the cockerel out of the sack. It woke in his hands, blinking, the draught wearing thin, a half-grown thing with its first real comb coming in red on its head. He held it close against his chest and felt its heart going quick and small under the feathers, and something in him turned over because it was a living creature and he was about to use its death as a weapon, and he had spent a great deal of the first life learning what it cost to spend lives like coin. He spent this one anyway. He did not flinch from it, and he did not dress it up. He simply held the bird and was sorry, in the plain way a man is sorry for a necessary thing, and got on with it. Open, he hissed at the carved serpents in the language the door was waiting for. The emeralds flared. The wall split down the middle and the two halves slid back into the rock, and beyond them opened the Chamber of Secrets, a vast pillared hall running away into greenlit dark, the pillars carved as more serpents, the floor wet and black, and at the far end the colossal stone face of Salazar Slytherin rising to the lost ceiling, ancient and grim, its stone beard reaching nearly to the floor. Harry stepped inside and fixed his eyes on the wet black floor at his feet, and walked forward into the green dark with the cockerel held warm against his chest and the wand ready in his other hand. And when he had come far enough that the chamber's echo would carry, he lifted his face toward the great stone statue, keeping his gaze on its carved chest and nowhere near the dark mouth above, and he spoke to it in Parseltongue the way a heir of Slytherin would speak. "Speak to me, Slytherin, greatest of the Hogwarts Four." For a long moment nothing. The water dripped. Then far up at the top of the statue, the great stone mouth ground open and something began to move inside it, a sound of scales sliding over stone that went on and on as length after length of the thing poured down out of the dark and struck the wet floor with a weight he felt through his boots. Harry shut his eyes. He had practiced this. He had practiced it for 3 weeks in a curtained bed, casting blind, moving blind, trusting the ear over the eye, and now he stood in the green dark with his eyes closed and built the chamber in his mind from sound alone. The slither coming, the direction of it, the weight, the wet displacement of the thing's body as it gathered itself and turned its blind to him, killing 21 eyes toward the small, warm shape that had dared to call it. He felt the air move as the great head swung toward him. He heard the hiss of it, vast and dry and ancient, asking in its own tongue who had wakened it. He threw the cockerel. He did not throw it to kill it. He threw it hard and high toward the thing's head, and as it left his hands he hit it, eyes still shut, with the small, sharp jolt of a stinging hex he had aimed by sound, and the half-grown cockerel woke fully and furiously in mid-air, terrified, and did what a terrified cockerel does when the dawn is in its blood whatever the hour, what every rooster in the world does at the top of its small, brave lungs. It crowed. The sound tore through the green dark, absurd and enormous, a barnyard mourning in the bowels of the earth, and the basilisk screamed. Harry had never heard the serpent scream the first time, because the first time it had died fast and ugly on a sword. He heard it now, and he would carry the sound, a high grinding shriek of a thing 1,000 years old hearing the one sound the world had built to end it, and the great body crashed and thrashed against the pillars, convulsing, the killing eyes rolling blind and useless because there was nothing a gaze could do against a sound, and the cockerel crowed again and again, blind, brave instinct, and the screaming climbed and broke and began to fail. Harry opened his eyes. He kept them on the body and away from the head as a matter of discipline even now, even dying, and he moved in close along the thrashing length of it with the wand up, and he did the thing he had come to do with the cold economy of a man putting down something that was suffering and would not stop being dangerous until it stopped entirely. He cut. The severing charm, honed for 3 weeks to a fine and brutal edge, went into the base of the convulsing skull again and again, precise, repeated, opening the great neck until the spasms guttered, and the enormous head sagged at last into the black water and lay still. And the only sound left in the chamber was the dripping of water and the small, triumphant racket of a cockerel that did not understand what it had done. He stood over the corpse breathing hard, the body 11 years old and not built for this, his arms shaking with the effort and the cold. He had killed the oldest, deadliest creature in the castle with a chicken and an hour of nerve, and he felt no triumph in it, only the flat, emptied-out steadiness of a job done that had to be done. He caught the cockerel, which came to his hands now meek and exhausted, and he tucked it back into the sack, because it had earned its life and he meant to carry it back up and return it to the run behind Hagrid's, and let no one ever know it had been the deadliest weapon in Scotland for the span of 3 breaths. He stood a moment in the greenlit quiet with the dead thing filling the chamber, and let the weight of it settle, because the weight was owed. He had killed older and worse things than this in the war and felt nothing at all, and he had learned to distrust the nothing, because the day killing came to cost a man nothing was the day he had become something the world would one day have to put down. So he made himself look at the great ruined length of the basilisk, blind and ancient and finally still, and he was not sorry it was dead, but he marked the death, gave it the half-minute of attention a death was owed, and only then went on. The marking was the whole difference, and he held to it the way a drowning man holds to a spar. Then he got out his tools and went to work on the mouth. It was foul work, and he did it methodically, kneeling in the cold black water beside the dead head with his eyes carefully averted from the filmed-over killing eyes, and he worked 2 of the great curved fangs loose from the jaw with the severing charm and a steady hand, each one as long as his forearm and slick with the venom that did not stop being venom because the heart that made it had stopped. He wrapped them in the dragon hide he had bought for the purpose, because basilisk venom ate through cloth and skin and most metals, and he laid them in the lined case in his satchel with a care that bordered on reverence, because these two yellowed teeth were the most important objects in either of his lives. 6 pieces of a torn soul, 2 fangs. He had carried fewer advantages into worse fights and won. He took last a long strip of the shed skin from the tunnel on his way out, rolled and stowed, because basilisk hide had its uses, and a man who had paid this much for a resource did not leave the rest of it lying in the dark. Then he climbed the long filthy climb back up the slick pipe, which the first time had needed a phoenix to manage, and which he managed now by a series of sticking charms and stubbornness. And he came up at last through the open mouth of the sink into the gray light of a bathroom an hour before dawn, soaked to the skin and stinking and alive, with 2 basilisk fangs in his bag and a sleeping cockerel at his hip, and the first hard piece of the year's work behind him. He sealed the chamber with a hiss, returned the bird to its run in the blue dark before the castle stirred, washed the filth of the deep place off his body in the prefect's bathroom whose password he still remembered, and was in his bed with the curtains drawn before the first owls went up over the astronomy tower. When Ron shook him awake for breakfast, he gave a convincing groan and complained of a bad night's sleep, which was the truest lie he had told in weeks. He let 3 days pass before he moved on the stone, because a man who does 2 reckless things in a row is asking the world to notice him, and because he needed the fangs cleaned and the body rested and the watchers reassured by a stretch of ordinary, friendly, unremarkable boyhood. He sat with Ron and Hermione in the library. He helped Neville with his transfiguration. He let Dumbledore see him laughing at the Gryffindor table. And under all of it, he watched the staff table and read the signs he had been waiting for, and on the 3rd evening he found them. Quirrell pale and shaking worse than usual, Snape watching Quirrell with a hard sidelong attention in the set of the spy's shoulders that Harry recognized from the first life as the look of a man who has worked out that someone is about to make a move and cannot prove it. Quirrell was going to go for the stone soon, tonight or close to it. The wraith on his back was starving and desperate, and the host was failing, and there was nothing left to do but try. Harry meant to get there first. He went after midnight in the invisibility cloak. He had thought a long time about the cloak, the first time and now. It had come to him at Christmas in the first life, a gift from Dumbledore. James Potter's old cloak returned to his son with a note urging him to use it well, and Harry understood now what he had not understood then. That the cloak was a hallow, one of the 3 deathly hallows, and that Dumbledore had kept it for years studying it, and had given it back as a piece of the long game, a tool placed in the child's hand to make him bold enough to walk into the dangers the headmaster needed him to walk into. Harry had written to the school in early September, a careful, childish letter asking whether his father might have left anything for him, and the cloak had come by return owl with the same note 2 months early, because Harry had simply asked for it instead of waiting to be given it. The old man had thought himself generous. Harry had moved his own timetable up by a season and let Dumbledore feel like Father Christmas doing it. The 3rd floor corridor was dark and the door was locked, and he opened it with a whispered Alohomora and slipped inside, and there in the small room, filling most of it, lay Fluffy, the 3-headed dog, all 6 eyes shut, snoring from 3 great mouths. Someone had been here before him. A harp lay on the floor near the dog's paws, still playing a soft enchanted tune to itself, and one massive paw rested on the edge of the trapdoor it was meant to guard. Quirrell, then, already down. Harry had not gotten there first after all. He had gotten there second by minutes, and the calculation reset itself in his head without a flicker as he eased around the sleeping dog, lifted its paw with a levitation charm, and dropped down through the trapdoor into the dark below. He fell into the devil's snare and did not fight it, going still and limp so the plant lost interest, then dropping through it onto the stone floor of the next chamber. He let himself down on purpose, eyes on the trailing tendrils above, and moved on. The next room was full of fluttering keys and a broomstick, the door beyond it already unlocked and standing ajar. Quirrell had no need to catch a key, Harry remembered. The wraith had simply blasted the lock. He went through. The giant chessboard stood in disarray, pieces shattered across the squares where someone had smashed through rather than play, and Harry picked his way across the wreckage in the dark. The troll in the next chamber lay slumped and unconscious down before Harry arrived, and he stepped around its reeking bulk and came at last to the small chamber with the table of 7 bottles, where Snape's logic puzzle waited and the riddle lay unrolled on the table, already solved, one small bottle standing empty beside it. He did not need the riddle. He knew which bottle carried the potion that let a man pass forward through the black flame, and he knew it had only ever held 2 swallows, and that Quirrell had taken 1. He drank the other, the cold rush of it filling him from the inside out, and walked into the black fire and through it into the last chamber. The mirror of Eris stood at the center of the round stone room, tall and gold and ancient, and before it stood Quirrell, turban gone, robes filthy, turning the mirror's frame with his hands and muttering, searching the glass for the thing it would not give him. He had not heard Harry come in under the cloak. Harry stopped just inside the chamber and looked at his enemy's back and made the last decision of the night, the one he had turned over 100 times and saved for the moment itself, because some decisions a man should not make until he is standing in the room. He could slip past in the cloak, take the stone from the mirror as only one who wanted it but did not want to use it could, and be gone before Quirrell knew the glass had emptied, clean, bloodless. The wraith left scrabbling at a mirror that held nothing, the host left to fail on its own, and Voldemort denied his fastest road back without ever knowing a child had been in the room. It was the safe play, and it was the right play by every cold rule he owned, and he had walked down here fully meaning to make it. He did not make it. He stood in the dark behind the dying host who had carried his murderer down into the earth, and he understood that the safe play left the wraith alive and drifting and free to find another host, another year, another road, and that he had a thing in this room he would never have again so cleanly. His enemy weakened, embodied, alone, and his own skin carrying a protection the wraith did not know about and could not survive. He had died the first time of being too slow and too kind and too willing to let the safe small mercies add up into a war. He would not be too slow tonight. "It won't give it to you," Harry said, and pulled the cloak off and let himself be seen. Quirrell spun. His face, when it came around, was gray and sweating and stretched over the bone, and the eyes in it were Quirrell's own, wide and bolting, and behind them, when they fixed on Harry, something else moved, something cold and red and suddenly terribly attentive. "Potter," Quirrell breathed. "It won't give it to you," Harry said again, walking forward unhurried into the firelight, "because it only gives the stone to someone who wants to find it and not to use it. You want to use it. So you can stand there turning the frame until the castle falls down, and it'll never show you anything but your master thanking you. I could have told you that an hour ago." The thing behind Quirrell's eyes took the wheel. Harry watched it happen, the host's bolting eyes going flat and cold as the wraith took the wheel, the spine straightening, the gray face going still. "Clever," said a voice that was not Quirrell's, thin and high and worse than memory. "So very clever for a child. You know a great deal, Harry Potter." "More than a child should. We shall have to discuss how you came by it." The eyes raked him. Help me take the stone, and you and I need not be enemies. Your parents begged for their lives, did you know that? Begged so prettily. I could give them back to you. The stone can do that. Help me, and you need never lose anyone again." It was a good lie aimed at a real wound, and the first time some younger version of him might have wavered at it. Harry felt the wound and let it be a wound and did not waver, because he had buried his parents twice over now and knew exactly what the dead were worth and what they cost, and he had not come down here to bargain. He came forward another step. "You don't have anything I want," Harry said, "and you talk too much. You always did." He saw the wraith decide to kill him. He had been watching for it, the small tell, the gathering, and as Quirrell's hand came up he was already moving, low and fast and inside the arc of the spell, and the curse went over his shoulder and cracked the mirror behind him. And then Harry did the thing the whole confrontation had been built around, the thing his mother had hung in his blood the night she died for him. He got both hands on Quirrell's bare wrist and held on. The host's skin blistered under his grip and began to burn. Quirrell screamed, a man's scream now, all the wraith's cold purpose drowned in the pure animal agony of flesh charring where Harry touched it, and he wrenched and flailed and could not break the grip, because Harry had learned long ago how to hold on to a thing that did not want to be held. Wherever the bare skin met Harry's, the flesh cracked and blackened and crumbled, and the screaming climbed, and Harry held the burning wrist and pressed his other hand flat against the side of the gray contorting face and gave the protection everywhere it could reach, and watched, with the steady terrible attention he gave to all necessary things, his enemy's body come apart under his hands. The host could not survive it. The first time Quirrell had died of this same touch, slower, with Dumbledore arriving to find the ashes. This time Harry did not let go early. He held on until the body had stopped screaming and stopped moving and begun to flake away into gray ash and ruin, until the thing that had ridden it had nothing left to ride, and then the dark soul tore free. It came up out of the collapsing body as a column of black smoke shot through with red, formless and shrieking, and for an instant it hung in the firelight over the ruin of its host, and Harry felt it turn its hate on him, felt the old pull of it reaching for his scar, for the kindred sliver behind it, trying to do to him what it had failed to do once before, to force its way in and wear him as it had worn the host now scattered on the floor. He had braced for this too. He shut the house in his mind and held the doors and let the protection blaze in his blood, and the thing recoiled from him, scalded, unable to find purchase on a body that his mother's death had made poison to it. It hung a moment longer, screaming its thin high scream, and then it broke and fled, pouring up and out through the cracked ceiling, out of the chamber and the castle and away, a ruined fragment of a soul streaming north and east toward the cold forests where it would have to wait, bodiless and starving, for a way back that Harry intended to make certain never came. The chamber went quiet. The black flames had died with their caster. Harry stood among the ashes of what he had killed, breathing, his hands unburnt, and let the silence settle, and did not look away from what he had done, because a man who kills and looks away from it is halfway to becoming a thing that kills easily. Then he turned to the mirror. It was cracked across one corner from the curse, but it held his reflection, and he made himself want the thing he had come for in exactly the right way, not to use it, not to keep it, only to find it and take it out of the world's reach, and he felt the weight drop into his pocket before he saw it appear in the glass. A stone the color of dried blood, ordinary and enormous, the philosopher's stone, the fastest road back to a body that his enemy had now lost. He took it out and looked at it in his palm. It could turn metal to gold. It could brew the elixir of unending life. It had kept a 600-year-old alchemist and his wife alive through 6 centuries, and they would die now when it was destroyed, as they had chosen to, having lived long enough. Harry closed his hand on it. He would see it destroyed properly, by the people whose right it was to destroy it, and he would do it in a way that left no trail back to a first year who could not possibly have been in this room. But it would not lie behind a mirror waiting for the next dark thing to come for it, and it would not be the lever that brought Voldemort back inside a year, and that was tonight's work, and tonight's work was done. He looked last into the cracked glass, as he had not let himself look the first time, not until the very end. The mirror of Arist showed a man his heart's deepest wish, and Harry, 11 years old and a lifetime past it, braced for what it would show him and looked. It showed him a kitchen he remembered, warm and loud, a long table crowded with red hair and laughter, a girl with a fierce bright face turning to say something to him, a man who was his godfather alive and gray and arguing with a werewolf over a chessboard, his own parents young at the head of the table, all of them alive, all of them together, no war, no green light, no ledger, no second life. Only the ordinary, impossible thing he was never going to have because he had chosen to spend himself buying pieces of it for other people instead. The grief came up through him like water rising in a well, and he let it come, alone in the ruined chamber with the ashes of his enemy and the stone cold in his hand, and he looked at the warm, crowded kitchen in the glass for as long as he let himself, which was not very long, and then he turned away from it. He had work to do, and the dead in the mirror could not help him do it, and the living up above could still be kept out of the mirror entirely if he was fast enough and cold enough and willing enough to pay. He pulled the cloak back over himself, and climbed back up through the chambers and the flame and the chess and the snare and the sleeping dog, and came out into the third-floor corridor with the stone in one pocket and 2 fangs already in his trunk and a dead man's ashes behind him, and stood a moment in the dark of the empty hallway, listening to the castle breathe around him, every soul in it asleep and safe and unaware that the war they had survived once had just, very quietly, been knocked off the course that would have killed them all. Then he went up to bed because there were classes in the morning and a boy who missed them would be noticed. The castle woke the next morning to find a teacher missing. Quirrell did not come to breakfast nor to his first lesson. By mid-morning the word had run the corridors the way bad news runs them, faster than any owl, that Professor Quirrell was gone, that the third-floor corridor stood open and breached, that the headmaster had been seen striding the halls with a face no one had ever watched him wear. By lunch the school was shut to its common rooms while the staff searched, and the searching turned up what Harry had left to be found. A round stone chamber far below the forbidden door, a cracked golden mirror, and on the floor before it a long smear of gray ash and ruined cloth that the teachers, when they understood what it was, did not speak of above a whisper. Harry sat through the lockdown in the Gryffindor common room with the rest, as frightened and full of wild theory as every other first year, and added nothing anyone would later remember. Ron thought Quirrell had run off. Hermione thought he had been quietly sacked. Harry let the theories wash over him and offered one quiet, plausible guess of his own, that perhaps the professor had gone after something dangerous and it had gone badly, which had the considerable merit of being true, and which no one credited because it was the dull answer and children prefer the bright ones. The fragments the staff could gather reached Dumbledore by evening, and Harry, who had spent 2 lifetimes learning to read him, watched it land. The headmaster came to the great hall for dinner, because not coming would have frightened the children worse, and he gave a short, calm speech about Professor Quirrell having left the school suddenly, and the third-floor corridor being now entirely safe, and he smiled, and the smile did not reach the blue eyes, and the eyes moved over the 4 house tables the whole meal long, counting, weighing, the way a man searches a familiar room for the thing that has been shifted an inch. Because something had been shifted, and Dumbledore knew it. He had built those defenses with his own hands and the hands of his staff, and he had hidden behind the last of them a stone that only a particular kind of soul could draw from the mirror, and now the host that had hunted it lay in ash and the mirror stood empty and the stone was simply gone, and there was no story the old man could tell himself that held all 3 facts at once. A possessed teacher does not burn himself to nothing. A mirror does not surrender the stone to a man who means to use it. A stone does not walk out of a sealed chamber on its own. Somewhere in his castle, the headmaster now understood, was a hand he had not accounted for, and Harry watched him understand it, and watched him begin, very quietly, to hunt for the hand. The blue eyes came to the Gryffindor table twice during the meal, and twice they passed over the small dark-haired boy laughing with his friends, and twice they moved on because the hand Dumbledore hunted was a grown and powerful one, a rival or an enemy, some adult player reaching into the game from outside, and not for one instant did the search pause on a first-year eating his pudding. That was the whole of Harry's protection, and he knew it. The truth was too strange to be guessed, and the cleverest wizard alive would run out every clever answer before he ever stumbled on the impossible one. Harry meant to keep it so. He laughed at something Ron said and let the gaze slide off him, and under the table his hands were perfectly still. The school did not settle quickly. A teacher vanishing mid-term frightened children in a way 100 reassurances could not reach, and for a week the corridors were quieter than usual, and the first years walked them in clusters. A new defense teacher turned up within a fortnight, a nervous retired Auror who flinched at loud noises and taught nothing of use, and the school exhaled and began to forget, because schools forget, because the term rolls on and there are essays due and Quidditch matches to lose and the bottomless capacity of the young to absorb a shock and move on to lunch. Harry let it forget. The forgetting was his ally. By Christmas, Quirrell would be a strange tale, the older students told the younger ones, and the breach of the third floor a closed and mended thing, and the only person in the castle still turning it over in the dark would be the one wizard clever enough to know the story did not add up, and even he would have other fires to watch. Snape watched him too that week, but Snape's watching had a different grain to it. The potions master had known before anyone that someone meant to go after the stone, had set himself against Quirrell to stop it, and now Quirrell was ash and the stone was gone, and Snape was left holding a suspicion with nothing under it. Twice he stopped Harry in a corridor on a thin pretext, a question about an essay, a remark about his father, and twice Harry felt the careful pressure of a Legilimen's behind the dark eyes, pressing harder now than in that first lesson, hunting for the thing the child was keeping back. Both times Harry held the front room open and let him in, and let him find an ordinary frightened boy who had heard the same wild rumors as everyone else and knew nothing useful, and both times the pressure withdrew, baffled, having turned up only an old ache for parents the child had never known, and a perfectly plain unease about the dark behind the third-floor door. Snape liked him no better for it. But after the second time he stopped treating Harry as a suspect and went back to treating him as merely the son of a man he had hated, which suited Harry precisely, because contempt asked none of the questions that interest did. He had the stone in the locked compartment of his trunk, wrapped in dragonhide beside the fangs, and he had thought hard about what to do with it. The answer had not moved, it had to be destroyed, and it was not his to destroy, and so it had to go back to the only people whose right it was. He would not carry it back himself. An owl to flame untraceable in a hand that was not his own, telling the old alchemist plainly that his stone was no longer safe and that the wise thing was to let it go, would reach the right ears without ever betraying the hand that sent it. The Flamels were 600 years old and tired, and when the time came, ready. He would give them the time and the choice and the dignity of making it themselves, which was more than the first life had managed, when the stone had been destroyed in a hurry in the smoke of a near catastrophe. When he was at last alone behind his curtains, the war locked back behind its doors and the day's deception holding, Harry let himself sit a moment with the size of what he had done, 2 creatures and a man in a single week. He had denied his enemy the fastest road to a body, and harvested the means to unmake 6 pieces of a torn soul, and he had done all of it alone and unseen and walked away clean, and the whole arc of the future that had ended with a portrait keeping watch over his murder had this week been knocked hard off its course. None of it felt like winning. It felt like the first mile of a very long road walked in the dark, with the people he was walking it for asleep and safe and entirely unaware, which was exactly how he wanted them, and which was, he had long since accepted, the loneliest way there was to keep a promise. He took out the names a last time before he slept, briefly. The way a man checks the pack is still on his back. Sirius in a cell on a rock in the sea, who could be reached now, who would be reached next, because a rat slept 3 beds away in this very dormitory, and the time to deal with the rat was coming. The ring in a shack under the floor of a ruined house, which a Christmas holiday would put within his reach. The locket in a London townhouse he could not enter until a wrongly jailed man was free to open its door. The grief moved in him low and known, for the warm crowded kitchen in the mirror that he was never going to sit in, and he let it move and set it down and slept. Above him the castle settled. Somewhere below in a high tower an old man sat alone turning a mystery over in his clever hands, and found after a long and well-managed life that a piece of his board had moved itself, and that he could not say how or why or whose hand had done it. Chapter 4 and Chapter 5. The living and the dead. The rat slept 3 beds away, and Harry had let it sleep for 3 months because the rat was patient and stupid and going nowhere, and the move he meant to make on it had to come with the right tool already in his hand. The tool was a square of old parchment in the keeping of two red-headed boys who loved a joke more than they loved their own skins, and getting it from them was less a theft than a courtship. He had been laying the ground for weeks without seeming to. He laughed at the twins' pranks before the punchline landed. He let slip once a small refinement to a stink pellet recipe that improved the range considerably, and watched Fred's eyes go round with respect. He let George catch him grinning at a dung bomb planted in Filch's office and said nothing, and was thereafter counted, in the private accounting of Fred and George Weasley, as sound. So when he found the two of them alone in a corner of the common room one evening in late November, heads bent over something they shielded with their shoulders, it was the most natural thing in the world for him to drop into the chair beside them and ask low, "All right, what is it? You've both been smug all week." "Potter," said George, "we like you." "We do," said Fred. "It's a problem, frankly. We've a reputation." "So we're going to show you something," George went on the strict understanding that if you breathe one word to anyone, living, dead, or portrait, we will deny it under oath and salt your pumpkin juice for the rest of your natural life. Harry held up his hand in something like a pledge, and they considered him a moment longer, two pairs of identical eyes weighing him with the gravity boys give only to the things that truly matter, and then they laid it on the table between them, a blank, worn, unremarkable square of parchment. Fred touched his wand to it. "I solemnly swear," he said with relish, "that I am up to no good." The ink bloomed out across the page in fine spidery lines, corridors and staircases and rooms, the whole castle drawn in moving detail, and over all of it, drifting and labeled in the same fine hand, the small inked dots that were every living soul inside the walls. "The Marauder's map," Fred said in the voice other people kept for relics. "Nicked it from Filch's office first year. Shows everyone, everywhere, doesn't lie, doesn't sleep, doesn't miss." He tapped a dot ambling along a fourth-floor corridor. "There's Filch now, the old toad, prowling for us. Made by 4 wizards who went here before us," George added with reverence. "Moony, Wormtail, Padfoot, and Prongs, geniuses, the lot of them, whoever they were. We've learned more off this map than out of 3 years of lessons." "Filch never knew what he had," said Fred. "Kept it in a drawer marked confiscated and highly dangerous, the romantic old fool." Harry's eyes moved across the 4 names written along the top of the map: Moony, Wormtail, Padfoot, Prongs, and he kept his face easy. Because Wormtail was the rat curled asleep in Ron's bed and Padfoot was the godfather in a cell over the sea, and the makers of this map had inked their own undoing into its heading and never known it. He had read these same 4 names the first time at 13 and felt nothing but delight, and not once thought to ask where Wormtail had got to. He thought to ask now. He already had the answer. That was the whole distance between the 2 lives, set out in 4 old names at the head of a sheet of parchment. Harry looked at the map and let his face do what it would have done the first time, when this thing had been a marvel and a gift and not yet a tool. And underneath the open delight he was already reading it as he read everything, fast and cold and complete. He found the Gryffindor Tower. He found the first-year boys' dormitory at the top of it. He found his own dot and Ron's and the 3 others, and there, tucked against the dot marked Ronald Weasley, in the precise place Ron's bed stood, a name that had no business existing anywhere in the world of the living. Peter Pettigrew. He had known it would be there. He had walked to this table for the sole purpose of being shown this name on this map, so that the knowing could be dressed up as finding. And still it landed on him, the plain black ink of it, a dead man's name printed quietly in a child's bedroom. The traitor who had sold Harry's parents to their deaths framed his best friend for the crime, and then folded himself into a rat's body and crawled into a warm Gryffindor bed to wait out the years in comfort while an innocent man rotted across the sea. The grief came, and the older thing beneath the grief that had no name he wanted to give it, and Harry kept both of them off his face and looked up at the twins with the shining eyes of a first year who has just been handed magic. "That's the best thing I've ever seen," he said, and meant it. Then, easy an afterthought, "Can I borrow it just for a night? I want to find the secret passages before you 2 have used them all up." They lent it to him because they liked him and because lending it made them generous gods of mischief, and Harry carried the map up to bed and lay behind his drawn curtains with it glowing in the wandlight, watching the dot marked Peter Pettigrew sleep curled against the dot marked Ronald Weasley, and he laid his plan for the morning and slept very little, because some nights a man does not, even when he has run the thing 100 times in his head. He did not try to take the rat himself. That was the lunge the younger version of him would have made, the brave, stupid grab that ended with Pettigrew slipping the grip and pouring away into the walls, gone for another 10 years. A rat that had hidden successfully for a decade would not be caught by a child's hands. It would be caught by an adult with the authority and the spellcraft to pin an animagus into human shape, and so the whole of Harry's plan was to set the map and the name in front of exactly such an adult, and to do it in a way that left him looking like a frightened child, rather than a tactician springing a trap he had carried across his own death. He went to McGonagall before breakfast. He knocked on her office door with the map folded in his hand and his face arranged into the distress of a boy who has found a thing he does not understand and is frightened by it. And when she let him in, he laid the parchment on her desk and made it work, the words, the blooming ink, and pointed with a hand he let tremble at the dormitory and the name beside Ron's bed. "That's a dead man, Professor," Harry said low. "Peter Pettigrew. I read about him. He died. Everyone says Sirius Black killed him. It's in the history books. But he's been in my dormitory every single night since September, right next to Ron, and I didn't know who to tell or if I was being stupid, or Minerva McGonagall was not a woman who startled easily, and she did not startle now, but Harry watched the color drain out of her face as she bent over the map because she had known Peter Pettigrew, had taught him, had mourned him, had believed for 10 years the same story the whole world believed. She read the name. She looked at the dormitory, at the bed, at the dot that did not move. She looked at Harry and something passed behind her eyes, a teacher's swift recalculation, and then being who she was, she did the right thing and did it fast. She told him to sit and not to touch anything, and she swept the map up off her desk and went straight for the headmaster's office at a pace that was very nearly a run, and the trap Harry had spent 3 months baiting closed without his hand within a mile of it. He was not in the room for the taking of the rat. He heard it later in pieces, the way the school heard everything, that the headmaster and the head of Gryffindor had climbed to the first-year dormitory with their wands drawn while the boys were at breakfast, that a spell had been spoken over a sleeping rat in Ron Weasley's bed, that the rat had thrashed and swelled and become a small, balding, cringing creature of a man with a pointed nose and a silver hand he had not possessed the first time, and that he had wept and gibbered and lunged for the window and been bound where he stood by 2 of the most accomplished witches and wizards in Britain before his feet left the floor. Ron, when he understood that the pet he had owned for 3 years, that had slept on his pillow and ridden in his pocket, had been a grown man in disguise the entire time, when a color Harry had seen on very few living faces. Harry steadied him with a hand on the shoulder and the few right quiet words, and walked him down to the lake away from the staring crowd, and let him be sick into the reeds, and did not tell him that the worst of it was already over and the best of it was about to begin. There were things you could not tell a friend without explaining how you knew them. Harry had a great deal he could not tell. He had grown used to the weight of it. He carried Ron's share of the shock for him instead, which was a thing you could do for a friend without explaining anything at all. The Ministry did not want to believe it. Harry had expected that, and watched it play out from a careful distance, through the owl post and the overheard talk of teachers and the things Sirius told him later. The Ministry had built 10 years of certainty that Sirius Black was guilty, had named him the first man to break out of nowhere and the worst traitor of the war, and Cornelius Fudge in particular had no stomach at all for the discovery that the most notorious prisoner in Azkaban had been thrown there without a trial, and had never been guilty of anything but bad luck and worse friends. Fudge wanted it quiet. Fudge wanted, Harry suspected, for the inconvenient rat to have an accident on the way to a cell. But Dumbledore was Dumbledore, and once the headmaster had set his considerable weight behind a thing it did not easily slide back into the dark, and Amelia Bones, who ran magical law enforcement with a hard jaw and a monocle and a complete absence of patience for tidy lies, took one look at a living Peter Pettigrew in chains, and understood at once that someone's neat story had just come apart, and meant to find out whose. They gave Pettigrew 3 drops of Veritaserum in a windowless ministry room, and he told the truth in the flat helpless drone the potion compels, and the truth was exactly what Harry had heard the first time, years too late to save anyone, that Peter Pettigrew, not Sirius Black, had been the Potter's secret keeper, that Pettigrew had carried the secret of their hiding place straight to the Dark Lord, that he had cut off his own finger and blown apart a Muggle street and framed his friend for 13 murders and fled in the body of a rat. There were, Harry was given to understand, witches and wizards in that room who had helped build the case against Sirius Black a decade ago, and who came out of it gray and shaking and unable to look one another in the eye. The prophet ran it hard for a week because a story like this one sold papers. The innocent man in the cell, the traitor in the rat, the famous boy who had found him out. Rita Skeeter wrote 3 articles, each one wronger than the last, and Harry read them at the breakfast table and said nothing, and went on being a delighted child whose godfather was coming home. Fudge gave interviews in which the Ministry had always intended to revisit the case. Amelia Bones gave exactly 4 sentences long, in which she said her department had failed a man very badly and meant to examine how, and then she stopped speaking to the press altogether and got on with the work. From the castle, Harry watched the whole slow public correction of a 10-year-old wrong roll past him, and thought about how simple it had been in the end, once the right name was laid in front of the right people. The truth had been sleeping in a Gryffindor bed for 3 years and no one had looked. That was the whole of it. That was how the first life had gone wrong over and over, the truth sitting in plain sight and no one with both the knowledge and the will to turn and look at it. He had the knowledge now. He was teaching himself, night by night, the will. It took 11 days. 11 days of the Wisengamot and the Prophet and Fudge trying to find an angle that did not end with the Ministry humiliated and failing to find one, because Amelia Bones would not let the thing be buried and Dumbledore would not let it be softened. On the 12th day the verdict came. Peter Pettigrew, guilty, sentenced. Sirius Black, innocent on every count, pardoned, his name cleared, his wand returned, 10 years of his life acknowledged as stolen by the same Ministry now stammering its apologies. The news reached the Gryffindor breakfast table on a gray December Tuesday, in the form of a Prophet headline and 100 owls and Ron thumping Harry on the back hard enough to bruise. Harry read it with Hermione leaning over one shoulder and Neville over the other, and he held his face in the shape of an astonished, delighted boy, and under the shape something he had no clean word for moved in him, slow and very large. He had done it. He had reached across a death and a betrayal and 10 years of another man's suffering and simply lifted the weight off, with a borrowed map and an hour of nerve and a knowledge no one could guess he had, and a man who had died the first time afraid and alone, falling backward through a curtain into nothing, was this morning free and innocent and walking under an open winter sky. He read the headline twice, and then he got up and went down to the lake by himself for a few minutes, and stood at the edge of the water where no one could see his face, and let it do what it needed to do, and then he washed it in the cold and went back inside and let his friends be happy for him. They let him meet Sirius 2 weeks later, at the start of the Christmas holiday, in McGonagall's office with the snow coming sideways past the windows. Harry had braced himself for it, and the bracing did not help. Sirius Black at 32 was gaunt and gray-streaked and hollowed out around the eyes from 10 years among the Dementors, and he was also, under all the ruin, unmistakably himself. The reckless, laughing godfather Harry had been given for a single year of the first life and robbed of forever, alive and on his feet in a warm office with the snow at his back, looking at his dead best friend's son with eyes that filled and brimmed and did not care in the least who saw. Harry, Sirius said, and the one word broke in the middle. Merlin, you're the spit of James, but you've got Lily's eyes, Harry said. I know, people keep telling me. And he crossed the room because there was a child's part to play and because for once the child's part and the rest of him wanted exactly the same thing. And he let Sirius pull him into an embrace that smelled of wood smoke and Azkaban, and underneath, something that was simply Sirius and had survived everything they had done to him. And Harry held on, and Sirius held on harder, shaking, and Harry let the grief come, because he had earned it, and because hiding it now would have been the lie, and not the truth. He grieved the Sirius he had lost even as this one crushed him to his chest. He grieved that this Sirius did not truly know him, knew only the bright idea of his lost friend's boy, and not the soldier who had fought beside the older version of this man, and watched him fall through a veil into nothing. He let himself have both at once, the having back and the loss folded into the same hard embrace, and no one in the room could understand why the child wept as he did, and that was all right because they did not need to. I'm taking you out of that house, Sirius said fiercely into his hair. Those muggles, you're my godson, it's in James's will, you were never meant to go to them at all. 10 years, Harry, I should have been there, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. It wasn't your fault. Harry pulled back enough to look up into the gray, ravaged face and let the older soul show in his eyes for just a moment, just for Sirius, a thing he allowed almost no one alive to see. None of it was your fault. I know exactly whose fault it was and exactly who let it happen, and the one who did it is in a cell now. So we start from here, you and me, whatever's coming, we start from here. Sirius looked at him oddly then, the way the goblin at the counter had, the way Ollivander had, the dim half-formed sense of a grown man catching something in the grain of a child that did not run the way a child's grain should. Then it passed, the way it always passed, written off as the strange old gravity of a boy who had survived too much too young. Sirius laughed, wet and ragged, and ruffled his hair and called him a cheeky little thing and James's son in the same breath, and the moment folded shut over the thing he had almost seen, and Harry let it. The custody was settled inside the week, because Sirius would not let it wait, and the Ministry, scrambling to look decent after 10 years of looking monstrous, was in no position to refuse a wrongfully imprisoned godfather his godson. There was paperwork and a tense quarter of an hour in an office while a Ministry witch read aloud the relevant clauses of James Potter's will, and at the end of it Harry belonged, legally and finally, to Sirius Black and not to number 4 Privet Drive. He thought of Petunia's face when the owl reached her with the news, and found he felt very little and was briefly surprised by that, and then not surprised, because some doors close so quietly that you notice only the silence where they used to be. The Weasleys came to him too, in the manner of the Weasleys, which was loudly and all at once, and without first asking whether he wanted it. Molly Weasley turned up at the rented house 2 days after the verdict with a basket of food built for 10, and folded Harry into an embrace that smelled of baking and wool and took him completely by surprise, because she did not know him, this woman. She knew only that he was her son's friend and a famous orphan and the one who had found the rat in Ron's bed, and she had decided on the strength of that to take him in, as she took in everyone who came within her reach, without conditions and without limit. Harry stood in the crush of her arms, and the grief came at him from the side, because he had buried 2 of her sons in the first life and watched her break over a body in a ruined hall, and here she was warm and whole and fussing that he was too thin. He let her feed him. It was the one thing he could do for her that she would understand, and it cost him nothing but the strange ache of being mothered by a woman who did not know she had already, in another life, lost her heart over him. That night after Molly had gone and the dishes were dried, Sirius sat with him by the fire and was quiet a while, turning a glass in his hands, and then he said, not looking at Harry, that he meant to do it properly this time. That he had been a wreck and a fugitive and a prisoner and was none of those things now, that he had a godson and a house and his name back, and that whatever came, Harry was not going to meet it alone the way James had had to. Harry watched the fire and understood that Sirius, who knew nothing of the war coming, had nonetheless caught the smell of it on the wind the way old soldiers do, and was promising to stand in front of it. He let the promise be made. He did not say that the standing in front was his own job now, had been since a green light in a ruined hall, and that the entire point of the cold work in the dark was to see to it that Sirius never had to make good on a word of it. He only said, "I know, me too." And Sirius looked at him oddly again, and let it go again, and they watched the fire burn down to embers together. He spent the holiday in a house Sirius rented in a small wizarding village, because Grimmauld Place was a horror that Sirius would not yet set foot in, and Privet Drive was a cage Harry would never be sent back to now that he had a godfather standing to claim him. It was the best 2 weeks of either of his lives, and he knew it while it was happening, which was its own particular ache, the knowing laid over the gladness like frost laid over a lit window. Sirius cooked badly and loudly. He told stories Harry had never heard, because the first time there had been no time, the war had eaten all of it. How James had spent a year of pure idiocy trying to make Lily Evans look at him, and a second year discovering she only would if he stopped being a prat. How the 4 of them had become animagi in secret to keep a werewolf friend company through his worst nights. How Lily had hexed a boy who insulted Snape, and then turned the same wand on Snape an hour later for thanking her wrong. Harry listened to all of it, the parents he had never met made loud and silly and real in a warm kitchen, and he let himself be a boy in that house. He let himself be loved by a man who did not yet know what he was, and he loved him back openly the way the hat had told him to, the brave thing tucked carefully inside the clever one. 2 days before Christmas, Sirius took him to Godric's Hollow. He had not asked to go. He had not let himself ask, because asking would have meant explaining what the place was to him, and what it was to him was not a thing an 11-year-old was meant to carry. But Sirius woke him one gray morning and said, gruff and careful, that there was somewhere the 2 of them ought to go together, that James and Lily were buried there, and a boy should be able to stand at his parents' graves at least once beside someone who had loved them. So Harry dressed and went, and said almost nothing on the way, because there was nothing he could say that would not have given him away. The village lay under deep snow, small and old and ordinary, a church and a war memorial, and a row of crooked cottages with smoke rising from their chimneys. At the far end of the lane stood a house with half its upper floor blown away, left ruined and never rebuilt, a sign risen out of the overgrown garden where strangers had scratched their thanks to the family that had died in it. Harry looked at the wreck of the house he had been born in, where his mother had stood in front of his cot and bought his life with her own, and he held his face still, because Sirius beside him already had wet eyes, and a grown man's grief needs no help from a child's. The graveyard lay behind the church, white and silent under the snow. Sirius led him between the stones to one in particular, and there it was, James Potter and Lily Potter, the dates that stopped far too soon, and the line carved beneath the names about the last enemy that shall be destroyed being death. Harry stood before it in the falling snow and read his parents' names off a stone for the second time in 2 lives, and the grief that came was not performed and not managed and not for anyone watching. He had stood here once before, at 17, in another winter, hunted and half-starved and a year from his own murder, and he had wept then for parents he could not remember. He wept now for more than that. He wept for them, and for the version of himself that had stood here the first time with no idea what was coming for him, and for the warm crowded kitchen that the ring in the gaunt shack had promised, and that he would break in 2 with a basilisk fang before the week was out. Sirius put a heavy arm around his shoulders and did not try to mend it, which was the kindest thing he could have done, and the 2 of them stood in the snow before the grave for a long time, the godfather who had lost his best friends and the godson who had lost his parents twice over, and neither of them said a word, because the dead are past words, and the living, for once, did not need them. On the way out, Sirius stopped him at the war memorial in the square, which to Muggle eyes was a plain stone obelisk, and to theirs became, as they neared it, a statue of a man and a woman with a baby in her arms, James and Lily and the child they had died for, frozen in stone at the heart of the village. Harry looked up at the carved face of the mother he had never known holding the carved bundle that was him, and he renewed in the snow, with his godfather's arm around him, a promise he had made before, that he would spend this whole second life making certain as few people as he could manage ever earned a stone like this one, and that the ones he could not save, he would this time at least have fought for with everything he had. And on the third night, when the house had gone dark and quiet, he took out the cloak and the fangs and went to do the cold work the whole warm holiday had been arranged to cover. The night bus would have left a trail, and Sirius would wake if the flue flared, so Harry went as he had taught himself to move unseen. Out the window under the cloak, down to the dark edge of the village, and then a long patient string of the small concealments and quiet jumps a clever underage wizard could manage without ever quite tripping the trace, riding the late trains and the empty roads with a forged note and a child's ticket, and the kind of unremarkable invisibility he had spent 2 lifetimes perfecting. It took him most of the night to reach the place. Little Hangleton lay silent under deep snow, the great manor on the hill standing dark, and below it, half swallowed in a tangle of dead briars at the foot of an overgrown lane, the ruined shack of the Gaunts, last and lowest seat of the line that had bred Lord Voldemort out of madness and cruelty and a stolen, glorious name. He knew what guarded the ring. He knew it better than the wizard who had set the guards, because he had watched, in the first life, what those guards had done to the cleverest man who ever lived. Dumbledore had come to this shack and found the ring, and seen, set into its gold, a cracked black stone that he believed to be the resurrection stone, second of the 3 deathly hallows, the one that called the dead back to the living. And Dumbledore, the wisest person Harry had ever known, had wanted it so badly, had wanted to beg the forgiveness of a sister 50 years dead so badly, that he had pushed the ring onto his own hand, though he knew past doubt that it was cursed, and the curse had begun to eat him alive from that hour, and would have killed him inside the year if a planned and worse death had not reached him first. Harry did not intend to put the ring on. He found it where it had always lain, sealed in a small box beneath a loose board under the filth of the shack floor, behind enchantments that would have killed an ordinary thief in the springing, and he took them apart one layer at a time on his knees in the cold, the curse-breaking theory from the locked book in his trunk in one hand and the foreknowledge of every word's shape in the other, slow and exact. It cost him the better part of an hour. There were 5 wards laid over the board, and he knew all 5, which was the only reason a child could pick apart what had been built to stop a master. The first was a plain alarm keyed to movement, and he stilled it with a countercharm before he so much as touched the floorboard. The second was a binding that would have fixed his hands to the box and held him there until something came to find him, and he peeled it back from the corners inward, slow, the way the book taught. The third was the one that had nearly killed Dumbledore, a curse of rot set to crawl up the arm of whoever lifted the ring and never to stop, and Harry did not try to disarm it, because it could not be disarmed, only avoided, and so he simply resolved not to lift the ring with his hand. The fourth was a duplication snare that would have filled the shack with burning copies of the box at the first wrong grip. And the fifth was older and meaner than the rest, a thing of the Gaunts themselves and not of Voldemort, a blood curse that demanded of the intruder whose blood he carried, and Harry answered it truthfully in the language it wanted, the parcel tongue that still lived behind his scar, and the old enchantment, hearing the speech of Slytherin's line, took him for kin and let him pass. He was, in a way it would not have cared for, telling it the plain truth. When the last enchantment guttered out, he lifted the box and opened it, and there it was, a heavy gold ring set with a cracked black stone, and on the stone, faint and unmistakable, the mark of the hallows, the line within the circle within the triangle. The pull of it was immediate and vast, and he had braced for the curse, and not quite for this. The stone did not threaten, it promised. It offered, in a voice pitched below hearing, the one thing the mirror of Eris had shown him, and the one thing every grieving creature alive would trade its soul to have, that he could call them back, not living, but near, shades, presences, real enough to stand in the room and turn their faces to him and be spoken to, his mother, his father, every name on the ledger, every friend the war had taken, the warm, crowded kitchen made solid enough to ache at. All he had to do was draw the stone from the ring and turn it 3 times in his closed hand, and they would come. Harry knelt in the freezing dark with the cursed ring open before him and felt the whole weight of every death he carried lean toward that small black stone, and he understood, with a clarity that frightened him more than the curse ever could have, exactly how Albus Dumbledore had come to put it on. It was not weakness. It was longing with nowhere left in the world to go, finding at last a door. The wisest man alive had opened that door, and it had killed him. Harry had buried more people than Dumbledore ever had. The door was right here under his hand, and his hand wanted it. It showed him faces while he knelt there, or his own mind did, or the stone did, the line between the 3 gone thin as breath, his mother's face turned toward him the way it never had in any memory he owned, his father laughing at something just out of frame, the friends he had carried out of the war in pieces standing whole and near. It did not lie exactly, and that was the cruelty in it. It offered a real thing, a true and terrible nearness, and asked in exchange only that he stop living forward and begin living backward, one conversation with the dead at a time, until the backward living was the only living left in him. He had watched a great wizard take that bargain. He had seen what it bought and what it cost. He knelt with the offer standing open before him like a lit door in a freezing house, and he made himself remember that the warmth past that door was painted on, and that the cold he was kneeling in was real, and that the real cold was where the living were, and that the living were the whole of the job. He did not open it. He knelt with the wanting until the wanting had shown him its entire shape and lost its power to surprise him, and the snow ticked at the broken window the whole long while. The dead did not want to be called. He had learned that the hardest way there was at the very end of the first life in a forest, with this same stone turning in his fingers and his mother and father and the others standing pale and loving and wrong all around him, near and untouchable and aching to be released. To call them was not to have them back. It was to hold a wound open and name it healing. And a man who spent his second life talking to shades in the dark was a man who had already lost that life, who had let the dead quietly eat the living he was meant to be saving. The hat had warned him in its dry voice to guard the things he loved and not let the planning devour them. He had thought the warning was about Dumbledore. It was about this too. It was about every door that offered him the past in exchange for the present, and there would be more such doors before the end, and he would have to refuse every one. He took the fang out of its dragon hide. He did not draw the stone from the ring. He had turned it over on the long road here, whether to keep it, bury it, hide it, use it just once, and he had decided, kneeling now with his hands steady, that the cleanest thing was to put the choice forever beyond his reach by making it impossible to make. He set the ring on the bare stone of the floor, gold and black stone together, and he lifted the basilisk fang in his fist, and he let himself think once deliberately and completely of the warm crowded kitchen and every single soul in it, and then he drove the fang down into the ring with the whole strength of his small body. The Horcrux died screaming. A voice that was almost Voldemort's and almost the young Tom Riddle's tore up out of the gold in a shriek that shivered the dead briars at the window, and black blood welled out of the metal and spread across the stone floor, and the cracked black stone split clean in two with a sound like a snapping bone, and the pull of it, the terrible loving pull, went out of the world all at once and left behind only the cold and the snow. And a boy kneeling over a ruined ring with a fang in his fist and his face wet and his teeth set hard against nothing at all. He had destroyed the resurrection stone along with the soul inside the ring. He had not been certain coming here that the venom would take the hallow as well as the horcrux, and now it had, and the door to the dead stood broken in two halves on a filthy floor, shut for good. Harry knelt there a moment longer in the wreck of the thing he had most wanted not to want, and let the grief have its full measure of him, alone, where no living person would ever see it, for the kitchen he would never sit in, and the dead he would never call, and the wisdom that had cost precisely as much as it was worth. Then he wrapped the fang again and pocketed the two halves of the broken stone so that no one would ever find them and ask what they had been, and got to his feet and went out into the snow and began the long dark road back to the warm rented house where a man who was alive and free and innocent slept on, with no idea his godson had ever been gone. 3 pieces of soul left, he thought, on the road home, with the dawn coming up gray and clean over the white fields. The cup deep under a bank that did not forgive, the diadem lost on a high shelf in a room of lost things, the diary in the pocket of a man who meant to do murder at a distance with it, and the locket which lived in a house his godfather owned and could not bear to enter, kept by a creature whose heart the same dark soul had broken half a century ago. 4 vessels then, and the one behind his own eyes that he was no nearer solving, and that would not, he was increasingly certain, solve itself. He was back through the window and into bed an hour before Sirius woke, and when his godfather hammered on the door and called him a lazy lump and informed him that there were pancakes, badly made, going cold downstairs, Harry got up and went down and ate them. He laughed in the right places. He passed the syrup. He was, for the whole length of a Christmas morning, simply a boy in a warm kitchen with a man who loved him, and he had bought that morning with a night on his knees in a frozen shack, and a wound he would carry alone and show to no one, and it was worth it. He had paid far more for far less. He let the living, for 1 hour, outweigh the dead, and decided that the locket and the house his godfather could not enter, and the broken-hearted creature inside it could all keep until the new year. Chapter 5 and Chapter 6, The Architect Number 12, Grimmauld Place unfolded itself out of the gap between 2 ordinary London houses the way the leaky cauldron unfolded out of its street, a tall, thin, black-faced thing that the neighbors' eyes refused to hold, and Sirius stood on the pavement before it in the gray February light and did not want to go in. "I swore I'd never set foot in here again," he said. He had the look of a man at the mouth of a cell he had only just escaped. "My mother's house, you'll see what I mean in about 4 seconds. Harry had asked him for this, gently, over weeks, framing it as a wish to see where his godfather had grown up, and Sirius had finally agreed because he could refuse Harry almost nothing now, and because some part of him, Harry suspected, needed a witness to walk back into the place with him. The true reason Harry wanted in was hanging in a glass cabinet on the 1st floor, in a locket no one in this house had been able to open or throw away, and he had not told Sirius that, because the telling would have led to questions he could not answer. The hall inside was dim and rotting and hung with the heads of dead house elves mounted on plaques, and the moment the door shut, a portrait at the end of the hall tore open its curtains and began to scream. A withered old woman in a black cap shrieking about filth and blood traitors and the disgrace of her house, and Sirius shouted back at his mother's painting with 10 years of Azkaban in his voice, and Harry left the two of them to their war and went looking for the elf. He found Creature in the kitchen in the basement, a small ancient creature with a snout like a bat and skin like a draped sheet, muttering to himself as he polished a row of tarnished silver no one would ever use, and the muttering was the same poison Harry remembered. Filth in my mistress's house, the blood traitor brought it, the half-blood brat. Harry did not bristle at it. He pulled out a chair and sat down at the long scrubbed table slow, so the elf would not startle, and he said into the muttering one word that stopped it dead. Regulus. The elf went rigid. The rag fell from his hand. He turned, and the great bloodshot eyes fixed on Harry, and the muttering when it came again was thin and shaking. What does the half-blood know of Master Regulus? What does he know of Creature's master, the good master, the brave master? I know he died, Harry said quietly, trying to destroy something. A locket with a green S on it that no magic in this house could break. I know he took it from a cave in the sea where the Dark Lord had hidden it, and that he made you take him there, and that he drank the potion that guards it so that you wouldn't have to, and that the last order he gave you was to destroy the locket, and that you've tried every way you know how for years, and you can't. Because it can't be broken by any magic a house elf has, or a wizard, or anyone. He let that settle in the dim kitchen. I know your master was the bravest person in this whole black house, and that he died alone in the dark doing the right thing, and that no one ever knew, and you've carried it by yourself ever since. Creature was making a sound now, a high cracked keening, the sound of a grief held 50 years and never once allowed out, and Harry sat and let him make it, because the grief was owed and there was no hurrying it. When it had run down to ragged breathing, the elf crept closer, staring at this child who knew the one true thing about him, and whispered, "Can the locket be destroyed? Creature has tried. Creature has hid it and burned it and begged it. Master ordered it and Creature cannot obey, and a house elf who cannot obey his master's last order." The keening threatened again. "I can destroy it," Harry said. "I have the one thing in the world that destroys it, and I'll let you watch so you'll know your master's order was carried out, so you can tell him wherever he is that it's done." He held the great wet eyes. "Will you bring it to me, Creature? Will you finish what Regulus started?" The elf brought the locket. He took it from the cabinet upstairs with hands that shook, the heavy golden thing with its serpentine S of green stones, and he set it on the scrubbed table in front of Harry as though setting down his own heart, and he stood back, trembling, and waited. Harry took out a fang. The locket knew. As the dragon hide came off the fang, the thing on the table grew warm and began, faintly, to whisper, and then the whisper found the inside of Harry's skull and showed him what it showed everyone who came to destroy it, his fears made flesh. It showed him a ruined hall and a portrait with half-moon spectacles. Showed him the arc of figures who would not lower their eyes and the green light coming from behind, and it showed him, worst of all, the faces of the people he was bleeding to save turning toward him one by one with that same cold, decided look, Ron and Hermione and Sirius and the rest, deciding together that he was too expensive to keep. "They will do it again," the locket whispered in a voice that was almost his own. "You are a weapon. Weapons get used and discarded. You cannot make them care for you. You can only make them need you, and need turns in the end to a green light from behind." Harry drove the fang through the locket. It screamed and bled black, and the green stones cracked and went dark, and the whisper cut off mid-word, and the vision broke and let him go, and he sat at the table breathing, the fang in his fist, the ruined locket smoking on the wood. He had heard the thing's whole pitch, and it had told him nothing he did not already carry, which was the secret of it. The locket had no lies, only the truths a person already feared, turned up loud. He had answered that particular truth a long time ago in a white nowhere, when he had decided to let the people he was protecting matter to him openly, even knowing what it might cost. The locket had found the wound and pressed it, and learned that he had already chosen to bleed from it on purpose. There was nothing in it for him that he had not already paid. Creature fell on the broken locket and wept over it, and then he turned to Harry and bowed so low his snout touched the floor, and from that hour Creature belonged to Harry the way few creatures had ever belonged to anyone, with the whole fierce devotion of a heart that had carried one unbearable thing alone for 50 years and been, at last, relieved of it. Harry had not done it for the devotion. But he took it and was glad of it, because a free elf who could pass unseen through the houses of the old families was worth more to the work ahead than any spell, and because Creature, having been seen once, would have walked into fire for him, and because some part of Harry that he did not examine too closely was simply glad to have given an old broken creature its one wish before it died. Sirius came down to the kitchen an hour later, hoarse from shouting at his mother's portrait, and stopped dead at the sight of Creature pressing a cup of tea on Harry and crooning over him like a nursemaid. "He's never made tea for anyone in his life," Sirius said. "He once tried to garrot a dinner guest with a curtain cord." Harry said only that he and the elf had reached an understanding, and that he would like to take Creature with him, since Sirius plainly wanted nothing under this roof and Creature plainly wanted somewhere to be useful, and Sirius, who would have signed the whole rotting house over to a passing stranger to be free of it, agreed without asking the question Harry could not have answered. From that day Creature came and went on Harry's errands through the shuttered houses of the old families like a shadow with a grudge and a purpose, and Harry never had to ask him twice for anything, and never once told him what the errands were truly for, and the old elf never once asked because he had been seen, and being seen was the whole of what he had ever wanted. The cup took a colder kind of work, because goblins did not weep and could not be won with the truth about their dead. He went back to Gringotts in the second week of the Easter holiday, with Sirius believing him on a supervised trip to buy school supplies, and he asked at the high counter for Griffook by name, and was shown, after a wait calculated to remind him whose house he stood in, into a small stone room where 3 goblins sat behind a table and did not offer him a chair. "I said I would knock," Harry said, "when I had something worth your while. I have 2 things." He laid the first on the table, a single basilisk fang wrapped in dragon hide, and he watched the 3 goblins go very still, because goblins knew the worth of things the way other people knew their own names, and there was a 60-foot basilisk's worth of venom and hide and rendered parts implied by that one fang, the most valuable carcass to surface in Britain in 1,000 years. "There's a dead basilisk under Hogwarts," Harry said, "ancient, whole, but for 2 fangs. I know where it is and how to reach it, and no one else living does. The school has no claim on it that anyone could prove. I'm offering Gringotts the carcass, all of it, in exchange for a service. You'll make more from the venom alone than from a year of vaults." The oldest goblin's eyes were bright and unreadable. "And the service? There's an abomination in one of your vaults," Harry said. "A piece of dark magic so foul it would sicken you to know it's been sitting in your bank, defiling your gold for 10 years, hidden by a client who never told you what she stored here. A small golden cup in the Lestrange vault. It is a thing that should not exist. I want it taken out and given to me, and I want the taking done quietly by goblin hands, since goblin hands are the only ones that can pass your wards without dying." He let the next part land flat and true. "You don't have to take my word for what it is. Send a cursebreaker down with the cup once it's out. They'll tell you I undersold it." It went against every law the goblins kept, and Harry knew it, and he had built the offer to give them the one thing that outweighed their law, which was the combination of an obscene profit and the genuine offense of having been used, of having had an abomination smuggled past them and hidden in their own vaults by a client who held them in contempt. Goblins forgave many things. Being made fools of in their own bank was not one of them. The 3 of them spoke together in their own tongue, low and fast, and Harry waited, and at the end of it the oldest one looked at him with something that was not warmth and was very close to respect. "The basilisk first," the goblin said. "Our people will verify it, then the cup, and Mr. Potter." The bright eyes held him. "You bargain like one of us." "I do not know where a human child learned to do that, and I find I do not wish to know. We have an accord." They sent their own down to the chamber first, naturally, because a goblin took no human's word for the worth of a thing. Harry gave them the way in, the bathroom and the sink and the sounds that opened it, recorded onto an enchanted slate so that no one need ever hear the parcel tongue come out of his own mouth. And a party of Gringotts cursebreakers went down into the dark under the school and came back 2 days later white and silent, hauling out the first cartloads of a carcass that would keep their renderers busy for a year. They did not speak to Harry of what they had found down there, the 60 feet of dead serpent and the precise repeated cuts that had opened its skull, but the regard with which the high counter treated him changed after that, sharpened into the wary courtesy goblins kept for the very few humans they had decided were not to be underestimated. He had killed the thing their grandfathers had told stories about, and sold them its body, and asked in return for almost nothing but a stroke against a client who had insulted them by hiding an abomination in their vaults. To a goblin that was very nearly the definition of a person worth dealing with. They retrieved the cup 3 days later, after their cursebreakers had gone down into the chamber and come back changed, speaking of the carcass in hushed tones and of Harry not at all. They brought him the cup in the same small stone room, the little golden thing with the badger engraved on it, humming with the wrongness folded inside it, and they watched, those mercenary unsentimental creatures, as Harry set it on the table and drove a fang through Helga Hufflepuff's cup, and the soul inside it shrieked and died. They asked no questions. They had been paid, and the abomination was out of their vaults, and the strange human child had dealt straight with them, and that was the whole of what a goblin required. Harry left Gringotts with 2 Horcruxes destroyed in a fortnight, and a balance of goodwill in the one institution in Britain that owed Dumbledore nothing and feared Voldemort not at all. The diadem he took on a Tuesday, because the school year had resumed, and Tuesdays were still the night the patrols ran thin. The room of requirement opened for him on the 7th floor the way it opened for anyone who walked past its blank stretch of wall 3 times wanting a place to hide a thing, and the door it gave him led into the vast junk cathedral of the room of hidden things, a city of lost and forbidden and forgotten objects piled to a distant ceiling, 1,000 years of the castle's secrets heaped in teetering aisles. He had walked these aisles once before, in the last year of the first life, in smoke, with the castle burning around him, and 3 of the people he most loved fighting at his back, and the memory of that walk lay over this one like a double exposure, the same towering junk lit by a different and quieter doom. He pushed it down where he kept the rest and went on alone through the leaning mountains of the forgotten, past a stuffed and moth-eaten troll, past a cabinet that ticked to itself, past a stoppered jar of something pale that turned to watch him go by. He knew exactly where to go. He had been here before in the smoke and fire of the last year of the first life, and he walked the aisles to the bust of an ugly old warlock with a chipped stone wig, and on the wig sat the lost diadem of Rowena Ravenclaw, tarnished and beautiful, the cleverest of the founder's relics fouled with the stupidest of magics. He lifted it down and laid it on the dusty floor and drove a fang through it, and the 4th soul died screaming among the heaped wreckage of 1,000 years, and Harry stood a moment in the dust and the silence and let himself feel the size of it. 4 down in a single year alone, where the first time it had taken a war and a fellowship and more dead than he could count to manage less. It would have been easy to call that a triumph. He did not. He wrapped the fang, drew the dust of 1,000 years back over the wreck of the diadem, and went down through the silent castle to his bed, where Ron snored and the term rolled on, ordinary and unaware. That left the diary, and the diary he could not reach himself, because it lived in a manner he could not enter behind wards he could not pass, in the pocket of a man who would, in a little over a year, fold it among a Weasley girl's second-hand school books and set it to hollowing her out 1 entry at a time. But Harry had a creature now who could pass unseen through the houses of the old families, and another who would do anything for him, and he had made, over the winter, a quiet point of letting one particular elf find him. Dobby came to him the way Creature had, because Harry had let Creature carry word through the strange underground network of house elves that the great Harry Potter wished to speak with the elf who served the Malfoys, and Dobby appeared at the foot of Harry's bed one night with his tennis-ball eyes enormous and his whole thin body shaking with the honor of being summoned. Harry had known Dobby in the first life, had freed him with a trick and a sock and mourned him in a grave by the sea, and it cost him something to look at the living elf and keep his face easy, but he kept it. He did not order Dobby to steal, he asked. He told the elf carefully that his master Lucius Malfoy was keeping a thing of terrible dark magic in his house, a black diary that the Dark Lord himself had made, and that it would be used, if it were not stopped, to hurt a child, and that Harry needed it brought to him, so that he could destroy it before that happened. Dobby, who hated his masters and worshipped Harry and wanted nothing in the world so much as to do a great good thing, wept and trembled and agreed, and 2 nights later he laid the small black diary on Harry's bed with his hands shaking, and Harry destroyed it with a fang while Dobby watched, and the 5th soul died, and a girl Harry had failed once was saved from a year of nightmares she would now never have. Harry gave Dobby a pair of his own socks before the elf left, and told him he was free to leave the Malfoys whenever he chose, and Dobby cried so hard he could not speak, and Harry sat with him until he could, because some debts you paid even when the creature you were paying did not know it was owed. He thought, when it was done and the diary lay ruined and smoking on his bed, of the girl it had been meant for. Ginny Weasley was 10 years old tonight, asleep in a crooked house in Devon, and she would start school a little over a year from now, small and fierce and lonely in a way she hid badly, and in the first life a black diary had found that loneliness and fed on it, written itself into her one secret entry at a time until it had nearly worn her down into a body the dark could wear. None of that would happen now. She would arrive at school an ordinary nervous first year and stay one, and grow up loud and bright and whole, and never know a thing had been coming for her and been stopped in the dark a year before it could arrive. That was the shape of the work, Harry thought, wrapping the fang again. Most of what he saved no one would ever know had been in danger at all. The best of his victories would look, to everyone living, exactly like nothing having happened. He had made his peace with that a long time ago. A man who needed thanking for the catastrophes he quietly prevented was in the wrong line of work, and Harry had decided 2 lifetimes back to be in the right one and carry the silence that came with it. 5 down, 2 left, the snake that did not yet exist and the splinter behind his own eyes. And on the matter of the splinter, the architect of his first death was about to make sure they finally spoke. He sat in the common room that evening with Ron arguing about Quidditch and Hermione frowning over a star chart and Neville feeding his toad scraps under the table, and he let the ordinary noise of them wash over him and took a quiet, careful accounting of where the year had brought him. 5 pieces of a dark soul destroyed, a godfather restored to life, and an innocent man cleared. A house elf in every old family's shadow who would die for him, a goblin bank that respected him, a snowy owl asleep upstairs in the tower, and 3 friends at this table who were alive and would, if he did the rest of it right, stay that way. He had walked into this castle in September with nothing but a head full of a war and a list of the dead. He had, between lessons, very nearly unmade the war. And the cost of it, the nights out in the cold and the wounds shown to no one and the whole vast loneliness of carrying it alone, sat in him where it always sat, low and steady, and he had stopped expecting it to lift and learned instead to work alongside it, the way you learn to work alongside an old injury that aches before rain. There was one piece left that he could reach, and it was inside his own skull, and the wizard who had once meant to kill him to reach it was about to be made to help him keep it instead. The summons came on a Sunday evening, a small note in emerald ink delivered by an owl Harry did not know, asking whether Mr. Potter would be so kind as to take Coco with the headmaster and naming a password for the gargoyle. Harry read it and understood that the long game had reached the place he had been steering it toward and dreading all year. Dumbledore had watched the impossibilities pile up. A teacher dead and a stone vanished, a decade-old injustice undone by a first year with a borrowed map, a basilisk carcass sold to the goblins by a hand no one could trace, a child who relearned a year of spells in 3 weeks and grieved like a soldier and bargained like a goblin. The old man had run out of clever answers, and he was going to look now at the impossible one. The office was as Harry remembered it, round and warm and crowded with whirring silver instruments, the portraits of old headmasters dozing in their frames, the great red-gold phoenix drowsing on its perch by the desk. Dumbledore sat behind the desk in plum-colored robes with his fingers steepled, and the twinkle was gone from the blue eyes set aside, and what was left was the thing Harry had always known lived underneath it, the oldest and sharpest mind in Britain looking at him with complete attention. "Harry," Dumbledore said, "thank you for coming, Coco." "No, thank you," Harry said and sat and waited, because the one who calls the meeting should be the one to spend the first move. Dumbledore studied him a long moment. "I find myself," he said at last, "in an unusual position. I have spent a long life understanding things, and I have spent this year failing to understand a number of them, all of which have one thing in common, which is you." He spread his hands. "I had thought you a remarkable boy. I am no longer certain boy is the correct word, and I confess that troubles me, because I am very rarely wrong about a child, and I have built rather a lot upon being right about you in particular." There it was, laid almost gently on the desk between them. "I know you are not what you appear, and I had plans for what you appeared to be." Harry looked at the old man who had raised him for slaughter with the kindest hands in the world, and made the decision he had been turning over all year, which was how much truth to spend. "You built a great deal on me," Harry agreed quietly. "You've been building it since before I could walk. You left me with my aunt so I'd grow up unloved and grateful, so that when the magic world finally opened its arms, I'd walk into them and never think to question the hands that did the opening. You gave me my father's cloak as a gift when it was a tool. You set a locked door and a death threat in front of a curious boy because you needed him to walk through it. And at the end of all of it, Professor, when the war was won, you needed me to die, because there is a piece of Voldemort's soul behind this scar, and the only way you knew to destroy it was for me to stand still and let him kill me. You've known that since I was a baby. You raised me carefully, kindly, completely, to be a pig fattened for slaughter. Tell me I'm wrong." The silence in the round office was total. The little silver instrument's word, the phoenix, opened one eye. And Albus Dumbledore, who had not in living memory been spoken to like this by anyone, let alone by a child, looked at Harry with his composure gone very still and very pale, and did not tell him he was wrong, because the old man did not in the end lie when the truth was demanded of him to his face. "How," Dumbledore said softly, "could you possibly know that?" And here was the seam Harry had decided to walk, the half-truth that would let him keep the deeper one. "The scar connects me to him," he said. "It always has. I see things, I know things I shouldn't. I've seen the inside of his plans, and I've seen the inside of yours, because the two of you have been moving me between you my whole life like a coin, and a coin that wakes up and finds it can read both hands is a dangerous thing to keep spending." He leaned forward. "I'm not telling you everything I know. I want to be clear about that, because you'll spend the rest of this conversation trying to work out how much I have, and I'd rather you spend it listening. I know what I am, I know what's in my head, and I have already started taking apart the things you don't even know exist." He told him then some of it, not the regression, never the regression. But the Horcruxes, named one by one, the ring and the locket and the cup and the diadem and the diary, 5 of the 6, found and destroyed inside a single year by a child, the headmaster had been watching the whole time and never once suspected. He watched the knowledge land on Dumbledore like weather, watched the old man understand that the child across the desk had, alone and unaided and unseen, accomplished the central labor of the war that Dumbledore had expected to spend years and lives upon, and had done it as a first year between lessons. For a long moment Dumbledore did not speak at all. The phoenix lifted its head and watched the child with its bright black eyes. Their frames, one or two of the old headmasters had stopped pretending to sleep. Harry let the silence run because he had said the hard thing and the hard thing needed room to be true in, and because a man-handed a shock will tell you more in his silence than in any words he later chooses. He watched Dumbledore set aside, one at a time, the explanations a weaker mind would have snatched at. That the child was lying, that the child was mad, that the child had been got at by some enemy and made into a mouthpiece. None of them fit the facts, and Albus Dumbledore had built his whole long life on the discipline of looking at facts even when they cost him everything, and so he looked. "You took the stone from the mirror," Dumbledore said at last, very quietly, working it through aloud. "Which means you wanted it found and not used, which means the flammable stone is gone, which I had wondered at and could not explain. You sent it to them." Something crossed the old face, an understanding arriving and bringing grief with it. "And you let them choose. I gave them the choice you would have made for them," Harry said. "They took it. It is unmade now by the hands that made it, the way it always should have gone." "The stone," Dumbledore said slowly. "Quirrell, that was me. Yes, I denied him the stone, and I burned out his host, and I sent what was left of him running. He has no body and no road back to one that I haven't already closed. The diary's gone, so the Malfoy girl will never be touched. The snake he'd have made into his last anchor will never exist, because I'm going to end him before he can make it." Harry held the blue eyes. "I'm telling you this so you understand the board has already been mostly cleared, and you didn't clear it, and you can't take it back from me, and the only choice you actually have left is whether you help me finish or whether you get in my way and find out what I've become." It was, he knew, a terrible thing to say to the wizard who had loved him in his own twisted, careful fashion, and he said it because terrible, true things said plainly were the only language that had ever moved Albus Dumbledore off a plan, and the old man heard it. Harry watched the long calculation run behind the blue eyes, the weighing of this impossible child, the testing of every clever answer and the discarding of them one by one, and at the end of it Dumbledore did the thing that made him, for all his sins, the greatest wizard of the age. He set down the plan he had spent a lifetime building because the facts had changed, and bowed his white head, not in defeat exactly, but in the grave acknowledgement of a master who has been outplayed by a student he did not know he had. "I have wronged you," Dumbledore said very low. "More than you have even said. I told myself it was for the greater good every step, and I told myself I grieved it, and both were true, and neither excuses it. I meant for you to die, Harry. I had made my peace with it the way a man makes peace with a sum he has decided must be paid, and you have, it seems, refused to be paid." His eyes were wet and old, and on Harry there was something Harry had never been given by him in either life, which was the look of one equal at another. "What do you want of me?" "The last piece," Harry said. "The one in my head. You only ever found one way to take it out, and that way killed me. I think there's another. I think the protection my mother left in my blood, the thing that burned Quirrell, the thing that brought me back the once already, can be turned to cut the fragment out without taking me with it. I don't have all of it yet. You're the only person alive who knows enough of the old magic to help me find the rest, so you're going to help me, not steer me, not manage me, help me the way you'd help a colleague you were afraid of. And when it's done and he comes for me the last time, you're going to stand where I put you and do what I say, and we're going to end this on my terms instead of yours." Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment, this child who was not a child, who had taken the whole shape of the war out of his hands and remade it, and then the old man inclined his head, and the gesture had in it the whole of an apology that words could not carry. "Tell me what you have worked out," Dumbledore said, "about your mother's protection, and I will tell you the rest." They talked until the windows went black and the fire burned low, two minds bent over the oldest and strangest magic either of them knew, the architect of the first death and the child who had refused it, and somewhere in the small hours they found the shape of the thing. That the fragment behind the scar was held there by the same sacrifice that protected him, and that the two could be turned against each other, the sacrifice made into a blade fine enough to cut the splinter out and leave the host whole, in a working so old and so dangerous that it had no name and had been attempted, as far as either of them could find, exactly never. It would take preparation. It would take a place and a moment, and a willingness on Harry's part to open the deepest door in the house of his mind, and let the oldest wizard in Britain reach inside and cut. It would, if it failed, kill him a second time and for good. Harry had braced for the old man to balk at it, to plead for caution, to ask for years of study, and a dozen safer attempts in the old way of trading the present's lives against the future's certainties. He did not. He listened and questioned, and where Harry's working ran thin, the old man's vast knowledge of the deep magics filled it in, the laws of sacrifice and the rules of the soul's binding, and the strange grammar of the fierce thing a mother dies of, made strong enough to leave its mark in the blood. They built it together across the long night, and when they had it whole, it was the most dangerous thing Harry had ever agreed to attempt, worse than the basilisk, worse than the burning of Quirrell, because it asked of him the one thing he had spent 2 lifetimes teaching himself never to do. To lower the walls of the house in his mind entirely, to throw open every door, including the one at the very back where the war and the green light and the boots were kept, and to hold them all open while another wizard reached past every secret he owned for the single foreign splinter and cut it free. "You understand what you are asking of me," Dumbledore said near the end, and his voice had lost its steadiness. "You are asking me to go into your mind with a blade of the oldest magic there is, and cut out a thing that is knotted to your life by the very binding that has kept you breathing. If my hand slips, if I sever the wrong thread, there will be no second bringing back. I have done many hard things, Harry. I am not certain I am equal to this one." "You are the only person alive who might be," Harry said, "and you owe me a death, so you will be equal to it." He let it land, and then he gave the old man the one thing he had kept back all night, which was a measure of mercy. "I am not doing this to make you pay. I worked that out months ago, that I could spend this whole life making you pay for the last one, and it would not buy me a single thing I actually want. I want them to live, all of them. That is the whole of it, both times round. You can help me get it, so help me, and we will call the rest even." Something in the old face broke and remade itself at that, and Dumbledore looked at him with the wet, ruined, grateful expression of a man absolved of a sin he had not let himself believe could be absolved, and bowed his head, and they went back to the work. "And the trap," Dumbledore said near the end, gray with exhaustion and a quiet astonishment he did not trouble to hide. "You said you would end him on your own terms. You have a way to bring him. He's bodiless and starving, and he can feel the pieces of himself going out one by one," Harry said. "He doesn't know it's me. He thinks it's you, or some rival, some grown power moving against him in the dark. When the scar piece is gone, he'll feel the last of his anchors fail, except the one he doesn't know he's lost, and he'll be desperate, and desperate things move toward the thing that's hurting them. I'm going to give him a door. He'll come to a place I've chosen, thinking he's hunting his enemy, and he'll find me with no body and no horcruxes and nothing left to come back from, and I'll end him the way it should have ended the first time. With me choosing it, not stumbling into it, not dying for it." He stood. "You'll be there, but you'll be where I put you. Is that understood, Professor?" They chose the place between them before the fire had burned down, not the castle, which was Dumbledore's ground and full of children. Not Godric's Hollow, which Harry would not turn into a battlefield for anything. They chose the ruin of the Riddle House on the hill above Little Hangleton, the great dark manor where the thing that called itself Lord Voldemort had murdered the Muggle family whose name it wore, the one place on the earth the Wraith was bound to by malice and old triumph and the magic of its own beginnings. It would go there. Hollow and starving and feeling the last of its anchors fail, it would go to the seat of its own, making the way a wounded animal crawls to its den, and it would find waiting in the ruin not the rival it imagined it was hunting, but a child who had survived its curse twice, with no body left to steal and no pieces of soul to fall back upon, and nothing in all the world to come back from. They set it for the final week of term, when the working on the scar would have had its days to settle, and they shook hands on it across the desk in the dying firelight, the oldest wizard in Britain and the child who had taken his war. And Albus Dumbledore, the greatest wizard of his age, the architect of 100 plans and the first death of the child in front of him, looked up at the small, dark-haired child who had just taken the war away from him and rebuilt it cleaner, and said, "It is understood, Harry," and meant it, and the long game that had begun beside a portrait in a ruined hall ended at last in a warm, round office, with the architect setting down his tools. Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. The battle he chose. He had spent 2 lifetimes learning that the most dangerous thing a person could attempt was the thing he could not practice first, and the working he had agreed to could not be practiced. There was no rehearsal for letting another wizard cut a piece of a soul out of your skull. There was the once, and either it held or it killed him, and he had lain awake the night before it, not from doubt, which was a luxury he had given up, but from the plain animal knowledge of a body that understood it might not see another morning. He made his arrangements the way a soldier makes them before a thing that might go wrong. A letter to Sirius, left where it would be found if he did not come back, saying the few true things a godson could safely say. A quiet word to creature. A long hour in the dark with the names, the dead and the living both, set out and looked at and put away. Then he got up and washed and climbed the moving stair to the headmaster's office like any other morning, because there was no sense letting the body's nerves run the hands that would have to hold the doors open. They did the working on the last Saturday before the end of term, in a sealed chamber off the office that Harry had never seen the first time, a round, windowless room of old stone that Dumbledore warded shut behind them with a quarter of an hour of silent, complicated magic. "Once we begin," Dumbledore said, "I cannot stop part way. If I stop with the binding half cut, it will kill you faster than leaving it whole ever would. So you will hold the doors open however long it takes, and you will not flinch, and you will trust my hand even when it goes places no one has any right to go. Can you do that?" "I've trusted worse hands with less reason," Harry said. He lay back on the cold stone where Dumbledore showed him and looked up and gave the old man the thing the working required, and that he had given almost no one alive, the truth on his face, undefended. "Do it properly." I didn't survive the first death to die of your nerves. The corner of Dumbledore's mouth moved, which was as near to a laugh as either of them had in them. He set the tip of his wand against the scar and spoke the words they had built together across that long night and went in. It was nothing like the lessons. The lessons had been a man pressing politely at a locked door. This was the door lifted off its hinges and the whole house thrown open from cellar to attic. Every room, every secret, the entire architecture Harry had spent a lifetime raising to keep other people out, and he held it open, all of it, while a presence vast and gentle and terribly precise moved through him room by room. It passed the front rooms, the furnished orphan he showed the world. It went into the back, where the war was kept, and found the green light and did not linger on it. It found the dead, the whole ledger made flesh, and Harry felt the old man's grief brush against his own as Dumbledore passed the names one by one, and neither of them stopped, because stopping was death. The strain of it was unlike anything the first life had ever asked of him. Every door in the house of his mind stood open at once, and a mind built to keep itself shut does not open without a fight, and the whole of his discipline now had to be turned inside out, spent not on holding the doors closed, but on holding them open against the reflex of a lifetime that screamed at him to slam them. He held them. He held them while the old wizard went deeper, and he felt his own pulse slowing and his own grip on the waking world thinning, and he held them anyway, because Dumbledore had told him plainly that the instant he flinched would be the instant the blade slipped, and he had decided long ago that he would rather die with the doors open than live having flinched at the last. Went deeper past the rooms Harry had words for, down into the place where language ran out, and there, behind the last and strongest door in the dark where the splinter had lived since before he could walk, it found the thing that was not Harry. The world went white, he knew the place. He had been here twice, the long platform under the roof too high to see, the cold light from nowhere, the train that never came and never would. He had died into it the first time and woken out of it into a cupboard. He stood on it now by choice, upright and whole, and at his feet under a bench lay the thing the severance had driven out of him. It was a small, flayed, wretched shape, raw and shuddering and barely alive, a piece of a soul that had been torn loose in a child's bedroom 11 years ago and lodged itself in the only vessel that would take it. It was hideous and it was suffering, and it had ridden behind his eyes his whole life, whispering and hungering and waiting. It was also, he understood looking down at it, a fragment of a frightened, ruined, monstrous thing that had once been a clever, lonely boy nobody loved, and Harry felt, against all reason, a thread of something close to grief for it, for the entire long catastrophe of what Tom Riddle had made of himself. He did not let the thread stop his hand. "You can't stay," he told it, not unkindly. "There's nowhere left for you to go. He has no other pieces. You're the last of them, and I'm not a door anymore." The thing under the bench shuddered and tried to drag itself toward him, toward the warmth and the life of him, the only home it had ever had, and Harry stood and let the working do, here in the white nowhere, what the wand was doing in the stone room. He let the protection rise in him, the fierce thing his mother had hung in his blood the night she stood in front of his cot and would not move, that fierce refusal with nowhere left to go, made at last into a blade, and it came up around him in a light that was not white and not gold and had no name, and the flayed thing could not bear it, could not touch it, could not stay in a place where that light burned. It thinned and frayed and came apart, screaming its thin high scream, and then there was nothing left of it on the platform at all. He stood over the empty bench in the cold, sourceless light and did not feel the triumph he might once have imagined. He had carried the thing his whole life. It had been the first lie at the center of him, the reason for the cupboard and the scar and the prophecy and the green door, the splinter around which the entire catastrophe of 2 lives had been built, and now it was gone, swept off a bench in a place that was not a place. What was left where it had been was not ease and not victory, but a vast echoing quiet, the quiet of a room you have lived in for years with a noise you long ago stopped hearing, gone suddenly silent. He stood in the silence of his own swept skull and understood that he was alone inside his own head now, truly alone, in a way he had not been since a year before he could walk, and that the aloneness was a kind of freedom and a kind of grief at once, the way nearly everything was now. The platform began to come apart at its edges, the way it had before. This time he did not wait to be sent back. He turned from the empty bench and walked the length of the platform toward the dark at the end of it, the dark that was the stone room and the old man's wand and his own body waiting to be lived in, and he stepped off the edge of the white nowhere on purpose, choosing, as he had not been allowed to the first time, to go back to the living. He came awake on the stone, shaking from his heels to his teeth, the scar on his forehead split and bleeding freely, Dumbledore gray and swaying above him with the wand fallen from his fingers, both of them wrung out past anything words could hold. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Then Harry reached up and touched his own forehead, and the scar was there, an old white line in the shape it had always worn, and behind it, for once in either life, there was nothing, no whisper, no needle of heat. No cold thing sleeping in the dark, only his own skull and his own thoughts, swept clean of the lodger that had lived there since he was a year old. "It's gone," Harry said. His voice did not sound like his. "It is gone," Dumbledore agreed and sat down heavily on the stone beside him, an old man at the very end of his strength, and the two of them sat in the warded dark and did not speak for a long time, because some things are too large to set words against, and the trying only makes them smaller. The wraith felt it go. Harry had known it would, and it did. 3 days later, in the last week of term, the reports began to come the way Dumbledore's network always brought them, faint and strange and frightening. A darkness moving through the country, a thing glimpsed by a terrified farmer where no such thing belonged, livestock found dead and bloodless along a line that ran, when Dumbledore traced it on a map with one long finger, north and west out of the deep forests and down toward a hill in the Midlands with a ruined manor on it. The wraith was moving. Stripped of every anchor it had ever made, feeling the last accidental one wink out of a child's forehead, naked and starving and certain at last that some power was hunting it through the dark, it was doing the exact thing Harry had told Dumbledore it would do. It was crawling home, to the seat of its own making, to the ruin on the hill where the name Lord Voldemort had first been spoken over the bodies of a murdered family, to wait for its enemy and make its last stand on the one patch of ground that had ever felt like its own. Dumbledore watched the dark line crawl with something between unease and reluctant respect, the look of a man seeing a prediction come true to the letter, and finding the precision of it more unsettling than any surprise could have been. "You told me it would do exactly this," he said one night, tracing the smear across the map. "To the day, to the hill." Harry only nodded. He had told him because he knew the creature the way you know a thing you have carried inside your own skull since before you could walk, and there was no comfort in being right about it, only the cold usefulness of it, the way knowing the tide does not make the sea any warmer. Harry spent those final days of term doing two things at once and doing both well, which was a skill the first life had beaten into him. By day he was an ordinary first year finishing his examinations, sitting his charms practical and his transfiguration written, scoring high but never quite first, laughing with Ron over the questions afterward, helping Hermione drill Neville on the properties of Moonstone. By night he met Dumbledore in the warded office and bent over the map and watched the dark line crawl down the country toward the hill, and the two of them made the last preparations for a thing neither could be certain would work. The hardest of those preparations was the one he had resisted longest, which was deciding whom to bring. Every instinct 2 lifetimes had built in him said to go alone, as he had done everything alone, because people brought into a danger were people who could die in it, and he had buried a great many who had followed him into the dark. But he had also learned, the slowest and most expensive way there was, that the person who insists on carrying everything by himself is the one who ends up alone in a ruined hall with a portrait at his back, and he had sworn in a white nowhere that he would not be that man twice. So he chose, not a crowd, not an army. 3 people and an elf, each picked for a reason, each placed where they could see him and could never be turned against him, each told exactly as much as they needed and not one word that would saddle them with the rest. Snape was the one he had thought about longest, and the one whose inclusion would have astonished the child Harry had been the first time, who had hated him cleanly and stupidly for years. But Harry knew what Snape was now, knew the whole long lonely shape of his courage, and he wanted at his side, for the ending of the thing that had murdered Lily Evans, the one person living who had loved her longest and grieved her hardest and given the most in silence to keep her son alive. He told Snape none of that. He only asked him through Dumbledore to come, and Snape told the bare shape of it, looked at Harry across the office with his black unreadable eyes and said, "The Dark Lord's death." "You are certain?" And at Harry's nod inclined his head a fraction, one professional acknowledging another, and agreed. It was the nearest the two of them would ever come to an understanding, and it was enough. They went up to the Riddle House on the last night of term after the leaving feast, when the castle was loud with packing and goodbyes, and no one would think to count whether one first year and the headmaster were in their beds. Sirius came at his side, told only that a thing had to be finished and that his godson would explain it after and not before, trusting him on the strength of a winter's worth of earned faith. Creature came because Creature went where Harry went now. Snape and Dumbledore came behind. They went quietly and without a trail, the way Harry liked to move, 5 figures climbing a dark hill toward a darker house. The manor stood broken on its rise, the windows empty, the great rooms full of dust and the wreckage of decades, and they took the positions Harry had drawn for them weeks before in a warm round office, each where he had set them, none of them at his back. That was the thing he checked, walking into the ruined drawing room where it would happen, that he had built this so no one stood behind him. Sirius at the door, Snape at the window. Dumbledore by the cold dead hearth, where the old man could see and reach and do nothing at all unless Harry called for it. Creature in the shadows, watching the lines no human eye could watch. And Harry in the center of the rotting room, alone in the middle of people he had chosen, the light of his wand low in his hand, the whole long arc of 2 lives bending at last toward the place he had aimed it. They waited. The ruined house ticked and settled around them the way old houses do, and the wind found the empty window frames and made a low sound in them, and the hours wore on. Harry stood in the center of the rotten room and did the thing he had spent 2 lifetimes learning to do, which was to wait without letting the waiting wear him down. He had kept watch in worse places. He had waited in the first life in 100 cold camps for 100 attacks, and he had learned that the whole trick of it was to keep the body loose and the mind level, and to refuse to spend on imagining the thing coming the strength he would need when it came. So he waited and watched the dark gather in the corners, and did not rehearse the next few minutes because he had rehearsed them already every night for a month, and the rehearsing was finished, and now there was only the doing. It came at midnight. He felt it before he saw it, a cold that was not in the air but under it, a pressure against the part of him that had once held a splinter and now held only the memory of one. The dust in the room stirred. The shadows in the corners deepened and ran together, and out of them poured the thing he had burned out of Quirrell a winter ago. The column of black smoke shot through with red, formless and vast, and shrieking its way into the ruined room, filling the space above the rotten boards, turning blind and seeking until it found him and went still. "You," it said in the voice that was worse than memory. "It was you, all of it, the stone, my servants. My pieces gone one by one, and I told myself it was Dumbledore, it was the Ministry, it was some rival risen against me, because no part of me would believe what the truth keeps telling me, which is that it was a child." The smoke roiled, and in it something like a face formed and unformed. "What are you? No child knows what you know. No child does what you have done. What are you, Harry Potter?" "I'm the thing you made," Harry said. "The night you came to a house in Godric's Hollow and tried to murder a baby and split your own soul doing it, you made me. You put a piece of yourself behind my eyes, and you spent 11 years teaching me, without either of us knowing it, exactly how you think. I know everything you are. I know every move you have left, and there aren't many." He raised the wand, holly and phoenix feather, brother to the you one this thing had once carried. "You crawled here to make a stand on your own ground. There's no stand to make. You have no body. You have no horcruxes, not one. I burned the last of them out of my own head 3 days ago in a sealed room with the help of the wizard you wanted to do your killing for you. You are a scrap of a dead man held together by hate and habit, and the only thing left for you to do is the only thing you ever learned how to do, which is to try to take a life because you spent your own so badly. So come on." He did not raise his voice. "Take mine. It's what you came for. It's what you came for the first time in Godric's Hollow, and look how that went. Let's see how it goes for you twice." For a moment the thing did not move, and the face in the smoke worked, and when the voice came again it had set down the screaming and reached instead for the old silk, the voice that had talked better people than Harry into ruin. "We are the same, you and I," it said. "Look at what you have done this year. The killing, the cunning, the lies to everyone who loves you. You have become magnificent, Harry, and you have become me, and the only difference left between us is that I will say so and you will not. Join me. There is no one alive who could stand against the two of us together. I could give you back everything you have lost, every face in that kitchen you grieve for in the dark. I felt it in you, the wanting, all those years my fragment lived behind your eyes. I know what you ache for. I am the only thing in the world that can give it to you." "You're the only thing that would promise it," Harry said. "That's the difference you can't see. I stopped trading the living for the dead a long time ago. You never once learned how." He lowered his chin a fraction, and his voice when it came was very quiet and entirely without mercy. "There's no kitchen for you. There's no road back. There's just this room and me and the end of you. Come and get it." The wraith screamed and did the thing it had no choice left but to do, the thing Harry had built the entire trap to make it do. It gave up on words and on stands and on everything but the old hunger, and it poured itself across the room and into him, the last desperate gambit of a thing that had worn a human body before and meant to wear this one, to force its way into the child it had marked and live. Harry had known it would come to this. He had built the whole night around making it come to this, and still the contact was worse than memory, a cold pouring in that tried to fill him the way water fills a drowning man, a vast old hunger reaching for the controls of him. A younger soul would have panicked, would have thrown up walls and fought to keep the thing out, and that was the mistake that had always been the mistake, because walls can be battered and a fight can be lost. Harry did not fight to keep it out. He had learned a colder thing than fighting. He opened and let it all the way in, as he had let Dumbledore in 3 days before, and then he shut the only door that mattered behind it, the door out, so that the thing which had spent 70 years making itself impossible to kill found itself, for the first and last time, somewhere it could not leave. It found no other door. The scar that had been its road was a healed white line over a swept-clean skull, and the protection his mother had died to give him rose to meet the invasion the way it had risen against Quirrell, the way it had risen on the white platform, and Harry held it open and held the wraith inside the burning of it and did not let it flee. There was nowhere for it to flee to. That was the whole of it, the whole of the year's cold work made good in a single moment. Every other piece of it was ash, the diary and the ring and the locket and the cup and the diadem and the splinter, every door it might have escaped through nailed shut and burned, and so when the protection took it there was no Horcrux waiting in a vault or a shack or a forgotten room to catch the fragment and hold it to life. It had spent its whole monstrous cleverness on being unkillable. Harry had spent a year and a death making it mortal. Now it died the way mortal things die, completely screaming, undone in the burning light of the one magic it had never been able to understand or counter or steal. It came apart inside him and could not get out, and the scream climbed and broke, and then between one heartbeat and the next it simply stopped. The cold went out of the room, the dust settled. And Lord Voldemort was gone from the world as wholly as if he had never poured himself out of a dying woman in a workhouse 70 winters before. The cost of it landed on Harry's body a half-second later, the way the cost of a hard thing always lands a half-second after the thing is done. His knees wanted to go. The protection had burned through him like a fever breaking, and his ears rang, and there was a taste of copper in his mouth and a deep wrung-out shaking in every muscle he owned. The body 11 years old and never built to hold a dark soul inside the fire of an old magic until it died. He stayed upright by the same stubbornness that had carried him down a slick pipe with no phoenix and across a frozen shack on his knees. He stayed up because going down was a thing he would do later in private, when there was no one left who needed to see him stand. The silence after was not like the silence in the ruined hall. That was the thing Harry noticed first, standing in the center of the rotting drawing room with his wand still raised, and his ears ringing, and the protection guttering down to embers in his blood. The first time, the silence after the kill had lasted exactly one breath, and then there had been a portrait's dry voice and an arc of figures who would not lower their eyes and a green light from behind. He stood now in the after-silence and waited for it, the old reflex, the certainty learned at a green door that the killing of the enemy was only the prelude to the killing of the weapon. He waited for the wands to move. The wands did not move. He let the absence of the green light be the strangest thing in the room. He had spent the back half of 2 lifetimes braced for it, the curse from behind, the people who counted his cost while he was still warm and found him too dear to keep, and it did not come, and it was not going to come, and the not coming was not luck. He had engineered it as carefully as he had engineered the death of the thing on the floorboards. He had freed the godfather who might have raged at his back into a man who held his shoulders instead. He had turned a suspicious enemy into a silent ally at the window. He had taken the architect of his first murder and made him a partner who stood now by a cold hearth with his hands open and visible, because Harry had told him to, and the old man had at the last chosen to be told. And he had refused all year every door that offered him the kind of power that makes other people afraid. He had sent the philosopher's stone to be unmade. He had broken the resurrection stone on a shack floor. He had never once reached for the death stick the portrait had feared would be the seat of the next tyrant. He had made himself, deliberately and at great cost, a thing nobody needed to put down. That was why the wands did not move, not because the world had changed, because he had. Sirius reached him first, and there was no curse in his hand, only his hands, grabbing Harry's shoulders, turning him, checking him over with the frantic care of a man making certain a child was whole. Snape lowered his wand at the window and looked at the place where the wraith had died with an expression Harry could not read and did not need to, because it was not aimed at him. Creature crept out of the shadows and stood at Harry's side. And Dumbledore came from the cold hearth, slow, leaning on the mantel and then on nothing, and stopped in front of Harry and looked down at him with the old blue eyes wet, his hands staying exactly where Harry could see them, open and empty and nowhere near his back. "It's done," Dumbledore said, the same 2 words Kingsley had spoken in another life over another body, and they landed entirely differently, because this time there was no portrait waiting to answer them. "It's done," Harry agreed and lowered his wand. He did not feel the thing people were going to expect him to feel. There was no triumph in it and no lightness, and he had not expected either. What there was, standing in the ruin with the people he had chosen alive around him and the enemy he had hunted across 2 lifetimes finally and wholly gone, was the slow easing of an enormous weight he had carried so long he had stopped feeling its edges lifting by degrees off his back. He stood and let it lift. He let Sirius hold on to him. He let the grief come too, because it was always going to come here at the end, the grief for the future he had just finished erasing, the warm crowded kitchen full of people shaped by a war that would now never happen, the versions of all of them he had loved and buried and would never meet again, because he had made certain they would never be born into the fire that forged them. He had traded the people he knew for the people they would get to become. He had understood he was making that trade since a white nowhere a lifetime ago. He had made it anyway and would make it again, and standing in the ruin with his godfather's arms around him, he let himself, for once, grieve the cost of his own victory without pretending it had come free. They burned the Riddle house behind them, because some places should not be left standing, and went down the hill in the dark. On the walk down, Sirius fell into step beside him and did not ask the dozen questions burning in him, which Harry counted among the great kindnesses of his second life. He only put a hand on the back of Harry's neck, the way a father might, and held it there a moment and said low, "You're all right," not a question, a thing he needed to say aloud to make it true. "I'm all right," Harry said, and found it was nearly true, and let his godfather steer him down the dark hill with that one warm hand at the back of his neck, a man who did not understand what had happened in the house above them and had decided that understanding mattered less than being there, which was, Harry thought, very nearly the whole of what loyalty was made of when you stripped the word down to its working parts. The days after had their own strange shape. There was the long, quiet walk down the hill, and a return to Castle emptying for the summer, and a final hour in the headmaster's office where Harry and Dumbledore sat across the desk from each other as something neither of them had been at the start of the year. Not master and weapon, not manipulator and pawn, but two people who had done a hard thing together and would carry it together for the rest of their lives. Dumbledore had aged a decade in a night, and he looked at Harry with the grave, open regard of a man who has been given back a future he had written off. And he said near the end that he did not deserve the mercy Harry had shown him, raising him from the role of executioner to the role of ally. And Harry said that mercy was not about deserving, that he had learned that the expensive way, and that a man who only forgave the deserving had never really forgiven anyone. Dumbledore bowed his white head and let the child who had outplayed him teach him the one lesson he had spent a long life failing to learn, and they parted as something close to friends. The papers never got the true shape of it, which suited Harry exactly. There was a story in the end, the kind of story the world could hold, that the lingering spirit of the vanquished Dark Lord, which the wise had always feared might one day creep back, had at last been laid to rest for good, with the help of Albus Dumbledore and certain others who preferred not to be named. The wizarding world, which had spent 10 years half waiting for the other shoe to fall, breathed out and got on with its peace, and never learned that the shoe had been caught in the dark and quietly disarmed by a child between his first-year examinations. Harry watched the long-held breath go out of the country he had saved and felt no need to be thanked for it, which was the same thing he had felt over the ring and the locket and the diary, the settled understanding that the best of his work would always look, to everyone living, like nothing at all having happened. He went home for the summer to a house with Sirius in it, not the rented place. Sirius had bought somewhere by the sea, a rambling, crooked house with too many rooms and a stretch of cold beach below it, because he said a boy should grow up somewhere with sky. It was a strange thing, learning to live forward again after a lifetime of living toward an ending. For as long as he could remember in both lives, every day had been a move in a game, every kindness a maneuver, every hour spent buying some piece of a future he might not survive to see. Now the future was simply going to arrive, ordinary and unearned, day after day, and he did not at first know what to do with the hours that were not moves. He learned to sleep past dawn. He learned to let a morning be only a morning. He still walked the house of his mind each night, still kept the doors sound out of a habit too deep to unlearn, but there was less and less behind them that needed keeping, and some nights he found he had walked the rooms and locked nothing at all, because there was nothing left to lock away from a world that had stopped hunting him. There was a conversation early in that summer that Harry had not expected and did not forget. Sirius found him on the beach one evening and sat down beside him in the sand without a word, and they watched the tide a while, and then Sirius said, not looking at him, that he knew there was something his godson was not telling him. That he had watched Harry handle the worst night of either of their lives with a steadiness no 11-year-old came by honestly, and that he had decided, after a great deal of thought, not to ask. Whatever it is, Sirius said, you carried it well and you carried it for the right reasons, and James and Lily would be so proud of you it would knock them both flat. So I'm not going to ask, I'm just going to be here, however long it takes, whatever it is. And Harry, who had braced for the question and prepared a dozen deflections, found he did not need a single one of them, and sat in the sand beside the one person who had offered to stand with him without first demanding to understand him, and let the offer be enough and said only, thank you. That's exactly what I needed, which was the truest thing he had said aloud to anyone in 2 lifetimes. He spent the long, light evenings of that first real summer on the beach below the house, with the wind off the water and the gulls going over. Ron came to stay for a fortnight, and they played a great deal of badly organized Quidditch over the dunes and lost track of the score on purpose. Hermione came with a trunk of books and reorganized the entire household, and was happier doing it than Harry had ever seen her. Neville came and was teased gently, and bloomed under it as he always could when someone bothered to water him. And at the end of August, the whole loud red tribe of the Weasleys descended for a day, and Molly fed everyone past the point of sense, and a small, fierce 10-year-old girl with red hair beat Harry twice at chess and demanded a third game. He let her win the third too, though he did not have to, and watched her crow about it, alive and bright and whole and entirely unaware that a thing had once wanted to wear her hollow, and the grief and the something that was not grief moved in him together, the way they always would now, the loss and the having folded into the same hour, and he found he could hold both and keep eating his dinner and pass the potatoes when Molly asked for them. Ron and Hermione and Neville never knew. That was a choice Harry made and kept, that the 3 of them would grow up as what they were, ordinary, brilliant, lucky children who had made a good friend on a train, and not as soldiers conscripted into a war before they were old enough to understand it. He had spent the first life watching that war take their childhoods one piece at a time, and he had decided that the one thing he could give them that no one had ever given him was the chance to simply be young, unhaunted, and unhurried, with nothing heavier on them than homework and Quidditch, and the ordinary dramas of being 11 and then 12 and then 13. They thought him a slightly strange, slightly serious boy who was unusually good at knowing what mattered. They had no idea they had been chosen, years before, in a white nowhere as the people he had crossed a death to keep. He preferred it so. The not knowing was the gift. A debt paid loudly is a debt the other person must carry ever after. He had paid this one in silence so that they would never once have to feel its weight. That was the whole of it in the end. Not a throne, not a name, not the world's worship. All the things the portrait had feared he would reach for, and the things he had reached for once in another life and watched curdle into a green door. Only this. A crooked house by the sea, and a godfather who burned the toast and laughed too loud, and 3 friends who never knew they had been chosen for survival and loved him as though they had chosen him back, and a fierce girl winning at chess, and an owl asleep on the windowsill in the last of the light. He had not understood the first time that this was the thing the whole long war had been about. He understood it now. It had always been about getting a few specific people to an ordinary evening like this one and leaving them there, unharmed and unaware and free. He had crossed a death for it. He had spent a lifetime of knowing alone in the dark to buy a summer evening that would look, to anyone watching, like the most ordinary thing in the world. He sat on the cold beach as the light went down over the water, 11 years old in his hands and a great deal older everywhere else, and watched the wind push the long grass flat along the dunes and let it stand again. And he did not reach for anything, and nothing reached for him from behind, and the sea went on with its old indifferent work, and Harry Potter, who had died once and chosen to come back, sat in the cooling evening and let the day be enough. Chapter 7 End.